Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Turnip's Digest. Today we have quite a lot to get through. Pretty important, I think, as well, given that this has become the big boogeyman of any dissident since the 1960s, 70s, give or take. We have a lot to cover. We'll jump right in. I'm joined by Cal Crucis. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well.
Fantastic.
As a good
So
Straussian, you have to criticize neoconservatism.
yeah. This is the first time you've been on my channel. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself if they aren't familiar with you?
I'm a random internet anon. Um, I, I like conceptually certain aspects of libertarianism, mainly as a contrarian. So everyone makes fun of Lawberts, but I think it's necessary, especially after what we experienced in 2020, to reconsider these ideas with the rising tide of war in every part of the world. Criticizing neocons is a good start.
Right. Yeah. And this is interesting as well from a libertarian standpoint, just because I think you and I read much of the same material on that front. Is that a lot of the key sort of like real libertarian types, not the Friedman high society types, more of like the Austrian types, sort of got their start criticizing this rising neoconservative movement, basically before it even got its name. So it's really miraculous how this one group managed to make enemies out of I guess most dissident uh, fathers of thought basically before they were even a formalized group called the Neoconservatives. I think that might be a fun thing to mention right at the outset here. Uh,
I mean, I think ultimately what is in aim in the pithy quip from Rothbard about repealing the 20th century, the thing that's in aim that conceptually is social democracy, whether it's left-wing social democracy or right-wing social democracy.
Right, and this is going to become very apparent. And then, if anyone has like sort of like an allergic reaction to something called right wing social democracy, believe me, you will start to see what that means. Because I just seems sort of like a red flag anytime someone starts to base their super cool against the grain line of thought that's going to completely turn our society back to the way it's supposed to, and they start basing that line of thought entirely off of very classical thinkers. Usually, that comes off as a de-radicalizing agent. It sort of seems like a way to try to escape controversy, and that's sort of the feeling that I get trying to read through these neoconservatives, which for anyone wondering, the selection that we have today, and for any others I'm probably going to cover on this channel, this comes from a collected group of writings called The Essential Neoconservative Reader. I picked this up at a bookstore because I realized I didn't actually have anything written by neoconservatives. It was just kind of a group that we all kind of knew what it meant. They've certainly been in power, at least for the first few years of my life. They've kind of taken over one of the major parties, and the last vestiges are still there, kind of calling some shots. At least a few of the more important ones. I saw this at a bookstore, and I realized I didn't actually know what they wrote directly. And from this neoconservative reader, it's just a collection of essays and important documents. We are looking specifically at Irving Kristol, his essay "When Virtue Loses All Her Loveliness: Some Reflections on Capitalism and the Free Society," George Gilder, "Moral Sources of Capitalism," and at the end, if we have enough time and energy to get through it, Michael Novak, from The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, same guy that reported on Vatican II and was called to be censored by a cardinal, if I remember correctly, for reporting too controversially or liberally, if memory serves correctly. These are the people we're dealing with, not small figures by any means. Most people have heard of the Kristols, especially Irving Kristol. George Gilder was a major ideological backbone of the Reagan campaign. Novak should be hopefully noticeable to our Catholic audience here. I think this is one of the few movements that's almost entirely composed of very public intellectuals, people who you absolutely know. It's not like our dissident sphere where people rediscover these niche philosophers every now and then who may or may not have had larger impacts beyond their uh, beyond their thin body of work, basically. So um, that's who we're dealing with today. We're specifically looking at capitalism and democracy, which are two major topics that neoconservatives always deal with. If you know any stereotypes about the Bush administration and their crusades all around the world, typically it is spreading democracy, human rights being the stand-in sometimes, and capitalism or American businesses or whatever else. That's the stereotype. Left, right, center, even some of their own advocates, I think, have sort of bought into that stereotype. So we're touching on two of their more core attributes today, I think. The other one that we're not touching on, I suppose, would be foreign policy, which I'm sure we can cover at a later date. So, with all of that said, is there anything that we should get out of the way first with in regards to this group? It might be worth noting that Irving Kristol was sort of like the original neoconservative, which was a term coined by Michael Harrington, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America. I think he was a lapsed Catholic. I don't know if he was actually religious towards the end of his life. In fact, I think he pretty much wasn't. It was a pejorative, and Irving Kristol, in sort of a proper neoconservative fashion, looked at the pejorative that was being labeled against him that brought intense ire among the people that heard it and thought, yes, this describes me perfectly. I am a neoconservative. And it was basically just it was sort of a cudgel against FDR-style liberals who were not going along with the 60s. That's the basic definition that's usually given. Do you think I missed anything there, Cal?
No, that's a pretty fitting definition. Or I mean, Irving Kristol self-describes, to use the cliche almost, he's a liberal mugged by reality. So I think this is a response to the rise of the new left, where Marxism is fused to some kind of mutant Freudian thought, applying class categorization to gender, race, and the divisions between the first world and the third world. And it's a good FDR liberal. You might want to decolonize. That might be your primary foreign policy adventure, to make the world democratic in a Wilsonian way. But that doesn't necessarily mean you want free love and all the other things that go with that.
Right, and I think that we can start now with our Irving Kristol piece, just because he makes this very clear from the outset that he's basically just opposing the new left, if you will. He starts off this piece about when virtue loses all her loveliness, is the quote that he's stolen from Fitzhugh, which is another sort of dissident thinker, I guess. I know some dissident right figures have latched onto him in some regards. He starts off basically addressing it, saying we have a problem with young radicals, and I will throw that on the screen here. So let me zoom in. Hopefully everyone can see this. You can read the thing for yourself on your own time. It's available publicly. The thing that we really need here to establish some sort of context is our youthful rebels are anything but inarticulate, and though they utter a great deal of nonsense, the import of what they are saying is clear enough. What they are saying is that they dislike, to put it mildly, the liberal, individualist, capitalist civilization that stands ready to receive them as citizens. They are rejecting this offer of citizenship and are declaring their desire to see some other kind of civilization replace it. This is the thing that really scared older establishment types, holdovers from the New Deal era. This dissident movement that was openly praising sort of other civilization, other modes of a social organization that were completely foreign to at very least the Anglo world. I'm sure that if you go into the continental parts of Europe, you could probably get different reactions from their establishments, but this is something that is very common amongst neoconservatives. They start off as liberal radicals basically when they're in their youth, if not outright Bolsheviks for some of them. If you want to read into the foreign policy part, Kirkpatrick was a Trotskyite, and then flipped towards conservatism later in her life. Crystal, if I remember correctly, I don't know that he was an explicit Bolshevik. I do know that he was very much a left-wing liberal in most regards until the 60s and 70s roll around, in which case he suddenly starts to look very conservative because he just simply has not moved that much. And these youthful radicals are scaring him. They are, as he's saying, rejecting liberal, individualist, capitalist civilization, which he's going to work from within this frame that the West is liberal, individualistic, and capitalist, and it's sort of evolved that way. Very sort of it's almost a Marxian framing of how the West has progressed there. I don't actually know if I would accept that this is the core of what the United States even was throughout Crystal's especially early lifetime. Liberal, individualistic, and capitalist. Very I think capitalistic might have been lost by this point in time. Certainly, every single social reform throughout Crystal's lifetime was to sort of extinguish any sort of capitalistic system in favor for a mixed one. Individualism, I don't know, was ever really existed as much as it's played up to be. Certainly, if you look in regions of the country like, say, New England, you don't really get this extreme individualism like gets portrayed about the 1950s or something. You get very much a communal organization, but a community in which people are expected to hold up their own. So you get that balance there. I don't know if you call that individualism. Liberal might be the only one, but who knows what liberal means? Cal, before we go out into the rest of this essay, what do you make of this characterization of Western civilization as liberal
These are all
individualist?
just, these are all kinds of taglines or slogans for what the United States was during the 1940s and 50s, right? It's more of it, ironically, is, trying to be an analyst. This is a very emotional appeal. These are all concepts that seem to be just good things that you want. And what you get with Crystal, which is, again, another irony of the neoconservative movement, is if these are former Marxists and you do accept the Marxian framing of history, that capitalism, right? A lot of your crude generic socialists today are, kind of third world socialists, village socialists, sort of some kind of perversion of Maoism, where you don't have to go through capitalism, you don't have to go through industrialization. But in traditional Marxian theory, capitalism is a positive thing. It destroys and wipes out all traditional hierarchies. It wipes out churches and religious authorities. It wipes out any kind of familial tie, and ultimately, all you have are the owners and the workers, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But of course, the purpose of this is to end in some kind of pseudo eschaton, right? You're trying to reach the end of history, and the end of history is the temporary dictatorship of the proletariat seizing the instruments of the state, so that then the state could then melt down. And then history's over, and then you have Marx's crude fantasy, right? You could go fishing, and then you could write some poems, and then you can go, take a nap, and then, you work a little bit, and then everyone is happy. But what you get with Crystal and some of these neoconservatives, the vision being cast is just chopping off the end. So capitalism never leads to socialism, I guess because the promise of an end of history is a fantasy.
Right, or if it does lead to socialism, something terrible has happened.
Yeah, right. So I mean, it's never the actual end of history. It's some kind of tyranny, and so you can never end history, and therefore you have this, and it dovetails well with certain left wing views of things. You would just have endless progress. History can never end. There's no point to this except in itself. So the penultimate revolution of capitalism is the revolution, and it just has to be sustained. It needs to be advanced internally. It needs to be advanced externally. It's almost this vision. An acquaintance of mine, said Star Trek, the original one, is just the projection of Kennedy era liberals, but applying it to the galaxy or the universe. And that's basically the same stomach. You just have to keep exporting and expanding this revolutionary idea. And it is this the 1940s, 1950s, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson type liberalism. And then right now it's hit this wall of opposition of people who do not want to live in that world.
Right, and they're specifically trying to go farther along the progression, which is the unacceptable thing. It's not that there are people opposing this new paradigm from the right necessarily that's worrying them. It's people from the left,
Right.
which
I mean,
is
it's trying to get off. I mean, whatever the alternative might be even worse. But right, this is your generic village socialist saying, right? Why can't we just love each other? And John Lennon singing, Imagine, and why can't we get off this roller coaster, right? Towards again, the kind of crude existence that would probably be even worse than this kind of liberal pseudo eschaton of just constant revolution and expansion, but. Yeah, I mean, this is why some people like Rothbard could find common cause with certain aspects of the new left, because they also attacked this endless progress, even though their vision would have been, probably something like Mao's China.
right. And this is something that even dissidents in the present do. Is they would also oppose this and probably find at least a modicum of common ground with people who do not like this liberal individualist capitalist system as Crystal is defining it. In
Right.
fact, this is like the core of any dissident, was that you don't think that the line can just keep going up. Living standards aren't actually being represented by the statistics and whatever else. This is pretty common stuff that most like traditional right wingers have and do oppose, as well now as the new left, which is the worrying thing. So, worth keeping in mind, liberal individualism and capitalist. All three of these things don't actually mean what an academic would define them, or what any sort of intellectual would define them as. It means things that Crystal finds good, or things that Crystal finds to be moral or desirable. That's the key takeaway, and it's going to become even more apparent as we keep reading this. And this shouldn't come as a shock to most people, because this is how most GOP politicians use these terms. There's a place that they got this from, and it's here basically. It's from this intellectual fountain of neoconservatism right here. These words mean things that we all like. If it's good and we like it, it is liberal, it's individualist, it's capitalist, and if we don't like it, it is authoritarian, collectivist, and it's socialist. That's just how it works. So don't read too terribly much into this. When I first read this through, I tried to give it an academic treatment, and it starts to fall apart. But we'll keep going just a little bit. He continues that most of them do not always put the matter as explicitly or as candidly as this is besides the point. Some of them do, of course. We try to dismiss them as the lunatic fringe. But the mass of dissident young are not, after all, sufficiently educated to understand the implications of everything they say. Besides, it is so much easier for the less bold among them to insist that what they find outrageous are the defects and shortcomings of the present system. So this is a classic neoconservative sort of dismissal of most of the concerns. Most of these people, we could try to relegate them as the lunatic fringe, but in reality they all are. They're just not educated or mature enough to understand it. This is a frame that he and all other neoconservatives have adopted. To quote someone that I was critiquing earlier this week, I think this is what C.S. Lewis would describe as bulverism. You're dismissing them because they're just young, uneducated, fringe lunatics, without actually addressing most of what they're saying. And this is
I
going
just
to
want to add,
become,
polemically, I like that strategy.
yeah.
Back from the '90s, there were these Batman cartoons based off the Tim Burton movie, and the world of Batman is 1950s liberalism, and there's something kind of endearing to the fact where you're coming up against right, one of these psycho criminals, supervillains, whatever, and then what is the diagnosis? It's not that the person's evil; he's just a psychopath. So it's a great way of just dismissing your enemies out of hand. This person's mentally ill. I don't want to deal with it. He just needs to be locked up and get
Right.
shock treatment.
Right. And just Cal, just something. If my internet drops, and it's been very windy and freezing for the last few days, if the internet drops, just keep going on the point, and hopefully I will return.
Okay.
But with that being said,
Turning the Cal's Digest.
with that being said, despite the fact that he's dismissing them on basically inherent grounds, for the vast majority of these people, education can only come with time. They're young. You have that time limit there. It's impossible for them to be as educated as this great neoconservative intelligentsia that they should aspire to be. and they're also radical fringe uh, pseudo intellectuals, I guess. All these inherent things that he's dismissing them with will go out the window though whenever he wants to make his own critiques about the system. This is another good thing to keep in mind. Another classic neoconservative tactic is to completely dismiss your enemies and then take the points that serve your agenda, and then use them. So what he's going to do here is he's basically trying to gatekeep these people from the left, and then he's going to present his own position as the correct position, not necessarily the full left wing or the full right wing position, but the correct synthesis position. He's going to adopt some of their critiques and say, well, they have a point here, so we just have to go along with my platform. This is how every neoconservative intellectual works. It's why the GOP does the things that does the things that we all know it for today. They'll gatekeep people that are more radical than them, and then they will sort of leech on to the points that they find useful, and then they'll use it to push their agenda that they wanted to push anyways. This is a classic tactic, if you will. So, he derides them for their education and whatever else, and then he goes on. Such shortcomings undeniably exist in the present system that we were talking about, and are easy polemical marks. And at the other end, it is so much easier for the adult generations to accept such polemics as representing the sum and substance of their dissatisfaction. It is consoling to think that the turmoil among them is provoked by the extent to which our society falls short of realizing its ideals. But the plain truth is that it is these ideals themselves that are being rejected. Our young radicals are far less dismayed at America's failure to become what it ought to be than they are contemptuous of what it thinks it ought to be. For them, as for Oscar Wilde, it is not the average American who is disgusting, it is the ideal American. And this is kind of where he gets into the more intellectual side of neoconservatism that I don't think persisted. He's focusing on the ideals. He's focusing on the theory now rather than the practice, if you want to turn an old adage on its head. He's basically using this as a wake-up call to his fellow academics and socialites and whomever else might read him. And he's saying, no, actually, these people aren't concerned with results and statistics and material or whatever else we want to talk about. They think that the direction, the end point, the goal is itself evil. He's trying to ham up this thread of a really insurgent, dissident left-wing faction that's just going to completely upend society, which, in fairness, it did. But, I don't think he was actually thinking that this is a threat. I think he's trying to position them as some sort of opposition, and then himself as a much better articulator of what needs to be done. So
I mean, that's why he says that. He says a little bit further down, right? That normally this dissatisfaction could be expressed in poetry, in the novel, in the drama, and painting, and today even in the movies. So they just need to go into art school so they can vent. That this is, again, it's like a psychologizing this and pathologizing this political movement.
Right, and so unfortunately for us, he was correct that these people were going to they were this gigantic dissident wave of leftists that were going to upend society. It's just, unfortunately, it doesn't appear that he believed his own accusations, and certainly did not act on such a present threat. It very much appears as a rhetorical tactic throughout this essay. And yeah, you mentioned the bourgeois society. We'll get there in a second, because that goes into part of his critique, sort of accepting this great opponent's frame, which it is a great opponent, but once again, doesn't seem that he actually believed his charge. The last part.
I want to qualify that. I do
Yeah.
think he believes it, and it does sort of come true, but not exactly in the way that it looks. So if you look at the 60s radicals, you look at the hippies, ultimately some version of it came true, but this is mutated through kind of conformity. So you don't get, some kind of crazed Maoist in charge of the country, federally subsidizing, gay bathhouses. But you do get Bill Clinton, who takes on this kind of normalcy of certain kinds of libertine acts. But it's still framed. I'm a good American, right? I'm not saying every woman should get an abortion. It should be rare. It should be safe. But and accessible. Right. So it's all, when the gay rights movement advances, it doesn't advance under leather guys in a parade. It advances under the auspices of being, we're a good white collar suburban family. We just want to have a house. We want to be left alone. We're normal people. So I think it comes true by normalizing and conforming to certain aspects of society, which is what makes it so much more dangerous than what Crystal even bothers describing.
Yeah,
And in the process of what happened to the New Left in becoming quote unquote normal Americans is exactly what happened to him. He went from being kind of a dissident intellectual to being a kind of generic party hack.
right, and that's fair. I suppose that he could just not have recognized it. And you can also see that very well with the Obama administration. Basically, did the exact same thing, but had more time, I guess. But it was another 8 years of doing the same thing, so
Right.
more got accomplished. You can sort of see this as a compounding effect. But um, I, I do feel like though that if he really was so worried about this present threat of this rising radical wave, I feel like he might have followed it a little bit more to kind of track its development, see where it was going, because other people at this time did get it right. They did predict sort of the way that this was going to go. It's it. I just feel like that maybe this was okay. Perhaps not. Perhaps it's not disbelief that was one of the key things here with Crystal, but perhaps it was a cavalier attitude or an aloof attitude, sort of a dismissive attitude, perhaps.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
I think what he says comes true ultimately is that they do become normal. They do just integrate into society, and these become kind of standard, either left wing or right wing social democrats that are just like Irving Kristol. So they end up. I mean, this is why all these people can kind of float back between the Republican and Democratic Party, even if the New Left kind of funneled into the Democratic Party. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's just kind of paternalistic pathologizing, right? You're mentally ill and you're dumb, but like one day you'll accept the way that things work and you'll play by the rules, which is, effectively what the people who staff the Clinton and Obama administrations do.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. So, the last thing that I wanted to take from this introduction before we get to the core of his argument is this last paragraph, because I think it's very much telling from where is the neoconservative movement founded? What does this great pontificator of neoconservatism have to say about the current right at the time, and what the arguments are doing, or just anything to do with its intellectual foundation? And he says, this is why one can make so little impression on them with arguments about how much progress has been made in the past decades, or is being made today towards racial equality, or abolishing poverty, or fighting pollution, or whatever it is we conventionally take as a sign of progress. The obstinacy with which they remain deaf to such liberal arguments is not all perverse or irrational, as some would like to think it is. It arises rather out of a perfectly sincere, if often inchoate animus against the American system itself. This animus stands for a commitment to what remains to be seen, but against what is already only too evident. So he's basically just saying we good people have tried to make arguments with this rising dissident left faction that progress is being made, poverty is decreasing, racial equality is being achieved, pollution is being clamped down upon, and it's just not enough for them. Why isn't it? Well, Irving Kristol is here to say that they are very much against the goals that are trying to be reached by the establishment at the time, I guess you could call it. I don't know what the generic moniker would be for this group of people that are being targeted by the New Left. But he and a bunch of his friends are sort of in awe that these great arguments and statistics or whatever else aren't convincing them away from their ideals. They want something more. Typically, they want more leftism is the simple way to put it. And he's sort of seeing this as they're just simply against the capitalist system and the democratic system as it's emerged. And that's why they aren't convinced by all these different all these arguments that are being made from statistics or from reason or whatever else. That's the introduction there. Do you have anything to add before we get into how he characterizes capitalism?
No, I think that's good.
Fantastic. So, with that introduction out of the way, Irving Kristol is now going to describe for us what is this capitalist liberal system that these crazy new left youth are rejecting. And you can read this introductory paragraph on your own. Calvin mentioned, or not Calvin, Cal here mentioned a sort of a weird pressure release valve that Kristol describes in bourgeois society, which he delineates from capitalist, democratic capitalist society. Um, Kristol mentions here that basically, if you have any sort of a dissent in the bourgeois system, people that aren't naturally going to fit in with its very commercial, almost sort of aristocratic elements, these artists and thinkers and whomever else, then you could basically you would express your dissent in poetry, in the novel, in drama, in painting, and then today in the movies. And then he's basically just going to make the point that in capitalism we don't really have this bourgeois drive to an aristocratic class that pursues these high ideals of art and poetry and thinking. The pressure release valve is gone, so it's expressing itself now in the form of the new left, which is a very strange sort of departure from the Marxist system that he's clearly working with, at least in the foundationally here, because this bourgeois and capitalist are usually sort of intertwined in Marxist historiography, but here to the neoconservatives, they're two different things. Bourgeois society is a better ideal, a better past system that had these greater and more ethereal ideals that you could pursue. Democratic capitalism, on the other hand, is much more materialistic and a bit more carnal. I guess is I think that might be a good summary for how it's being described here, which is this is a novel idea. It's a departure from I think any other line of thought. I don't know many people that would delineate capitalism from bourgeois society, except for Kristol here. And I think this is because I think this is perhaps one of the greatest indicators that he is a lefty progressive, but he got left behind. He didn't continue going along with the youth. He wants this bourgeois society that he's describing. I think this is me talking here. It seems he wants this bourgeois society, which is basically just his youth, maybe a couple generations beforehand. That was the great culmination of history, and everything past then has been sort of mistaken in some way, shape, or form, and continues to gather more mistakes as time goes on. Cal, how would you describe that characterization before we jump directly in?
Well, I think part of it's also the shifting expectations that is, almost derivative from the current state of things. So what I mean is that you have a system from the 30s and 40s and 50s, out of not so much the New Deal, but World War II and the destruction of the United States' major industrial competitors in Germany and Japan. And so the United States lives in a fairy tale world for about 2 decades, where you can have raising wages for your working class. You can have increased profits for management and for stockholders and investors. The government can tax more and more to then build infrastructure projects like the International Highway Station or the International Highway Station or system. And you can do all this and everyone seems to get richer. And so isn't that the promise of quote unquote liberal democratic capitalism? And then you get this rising generation, the 60s, they're dissatisfied, with the loser Mario Savio wanting to throw himself into gears. Right? We don't want to go work at the Ford Motor Company. We don't care about high money or high wages. We don't care about money. We want to express ourselves. We want to feel something. There's this backlash, and you can see this in the film of the 60s and 70s, this backlash against quote unquote materialistic society. But for Kristol, right, isn't that the whole point, right? The whole point of left-wing political organization is for the material well-being of the human race. So everyone's getting paid more, everyone has more stuff. If materialism is the core reality, that ideas and all this other stuff is just superstructures added on, hiding the reality of things, then it doesn't make sense for these people to resist. And you will find Marxists in the 60s and 70s to see the new left as I forget the name of the guy. It was not anyone important, but he considered the New Left and the hippies to be Hitlerists, and so this is this kind of right wing movement that's all driven by aesthetics and personality, and it's trying to wreck the material benefits of not just democratic socialism or social democracy, but how this is advancing towards true socialism. And so I think Crystal just finds this kind of absurd, right? We have a system and it works, but now this new generation doesn't like it, and it's also they're agitating at the moment that the late '60s and in the early '70s, where the promises of this system seem to be stalling out. But from Crystal's point of view, being more of an ideologue than an actual hard money economist or kind of hard tax looking at data. Right, this doesn't make any sense. Yeah, there's some shocks and stuff, but the system works, and now they're trying to tear down the system, and it doesn't make any sense. Probably because they're too dumb and they're mentally ill, and they want to, go out, live in a commune, and do drugs.
Right. And so you keep mentioning that the system, everything that's promising it's kind of working. If it's these crazy youth are wanting to tear down the system that delivers great material prosperity and whatnot else that's been promised. So this is kind of where in the essay, very early on, that I realized that capitalism and all these other great things that Crystal mentions isn't actually the academic meaning of the term. It's what he is idiosyncratically defining as capitalism or liberalism or whatever else. And this is where we get the definition. So he says, what did capitalism promise? First of all, it promised continued improvement in the material conditions of all of its citizens, a promise without precedent in human history. Secondly, it promised an equally unprecedented measure of individual freedom for all these same citizens. And lastly, it held out the promise that amidst this prosperity and liberty, the individual could satisfy his instinct for self-perfection, for leading a virtuous life that satisfied the demands of his spirit, or, as one used to say, his soul, and that the free exercise of such individual virtue would aggregate into a just society. So this, according to Crystal, is capitalism. It's a set of promises that are promised by something. I don't think that he actually mentions that. I guess if one could chalk this down to just rhetoric, but I have a feeling that he's probably referring to academics or state bureaucrats or politicians or something else. That he's describing this very much as a political system and not necessarily an economic system. And I really wanted to dive into this section in particular because this is where I think this is probably where a lot of dissidents, especially right now, would probably agree with him. They would probably agree with this characterization and then the obvious faults that he's going to find in the system as the essay develops. Because most dissidents right now have taken very much a anti-libertarian bent, sort of like a knee-jerk reaction against them. And I think that it's actually unwittingly led them into sort of neoconservative critiques of the economic system, which would be most ironic for a group of dissidents to fall in, a trap for them to fall into. So what does capitalism promise? Well, first of all, I don't think that Cal, you or I would say that capitalism is a thing or a system that promises anything. I think that we would give a very value-neutral assessment of what it is, if we were to even use the word at all.
It's loaded with a lot of ambiguity, and it really is a term that is less. It's more obscure. I mean, it's you look at your average left-wing academic, and they throw around terms like capitalism and neoliberalism, which are just like bad guys. And then for Crystal, it's the value reversal. Capitalism is good guys, and that's what capitalism is for. You mentioned the Bush administration. Same thing. It's just whoever believes in this is a good guy, and whoever is against it's a bad guy. But you have earlier 19th century. I mean, he uses Fitzhugh. Fitzhugh is a huge critic of capitalism, and by that he just means basically the merchants of Boston and New York.
Right, and this is I think this is in stark contrast to anyone that actually values free enterprise, which is itself not necessarily an ideological system. One can and does make a very convincing argument from American history and Anglo history, at the very least, that it's just the natural state for at least this people, if not others, to exist in this system where you have extreme decentralization of commercial activity, where people can make exchanges freely and all this other stuff about being productive, exchanging your surplus, whatever else. you can very clearly see in history that this is a natural way that at least one people does things. The and the reason that we're focusing on these Anglos is because this neoconservative movement is very much a U.S. phenomenon that sort of displaced perhaps an Anglo ruling class. You can kind of see that in the modern day with the way that the GOP looks at the very least. But I think this is a good key distinction to make. Anyone who actually likes what crystal means, at least conceptually, by this system, this free enterprise system or whatever else properly defined, would not say that it promises anything. They would say it's a state of being. This is important for analyses because whenever you get into does capitalism promise something, you just have to disprove the promise, and then you can move on from the system because it's obviously failed. If it's just a way that people organize and a way that people behave, a way that people act, then suddenly it's not this ideological phenomenon that you can prove or disprove or whatever else that issues promises that can be broken or kept. Suddenly it's just a thing that you compare to other systems of organization that you can look at and compare to. You can compare their metrics based on whatever you find valuable, but you can add the value to it yourself and then make your judgment. And that's what any good thinking person would do. Is they would look at the system, they would say, this is what it does, this is what it leads to, yada yada, and then this is why I think that it is good or bad. That's a much better, more thorough treatment that's being allowed of the system, just by not considering it some being that issues promises. It's a much fuller system. So that's the first issue here that I actually think a lot of the DR falls into this trap. I think that a lot of the dissidents that are in our spheres will treat capitalism as some being with promises. Certainly, it's what a lot of our more popular figures will say. Well, capitalism did not work; it didn't keep its promises. People are poorer. You can't buy houses now as cheaply as other generations could. Therefore, capitalism has failed. We must find something else. That's a very common line of thought that I see many of our good friends engaging in. I think that it's an intellectual fault, if you will, and coincidentally a neoconservative fault as well. So he says it promised continued improvement in the material conditions of all of its citizens. So this first part here, does capitalism promise that? Well, not necessarily. Capitalism, if we treat it as a societal organization, a societal state of being, it can't promise that things will just continue to be better. What it does promise is that you can exchange without any impediment, at least as your community or whatever else regulates. That's typically the system in which or the governmental system that you see capitalism in. It promises that at the very least. It allows that if you want to use this framing. If you want to not use this framing, then it allows people to improve their station without infringement. That's the typical system that you'll see in history. And is this without precedent in human history? Well, no, not necessarily. Why did the manorial system in medieval Europe, or early medieval Europe, develop? Why did the feudal system develop out of that? Well, it was because things were better. If things were not an active improvement under those systems, they would not have emerged. They would have died out very quickly in a very warlike society that certainly early medieval Europe was, and then to a slightly less extent feudal Europe was. This is the guiding principle for why any economic or social system develops, is because things are going to be better than they have been before. It's why anyone would adopt anything. It's why they get beaten out. It's why people that don't go along with these things get beaten out, is because they didn't choose the correct thing. They didn't organize correctly or whatever else. I think this is a hyperbolic here. He's trying to build up capitalism as being this overpromised or oversold system that he's going to tear down later in this essay, but from the correct position, not this weird leftist position. I feel like this is a good thing to keep track of. He's building up capitalism as some great monolith, an idol basically, that he has to critique sensibly from the well-established, the educated and mature position that these new leftists just don't have a grasp upon. So, anything on that first promise there, Cal?
No, let's carry on.
Fantastic. So, secondly, it promised an equally unprecedented measure of individual freedom for all these citizens. So, this is where a lot of the Austrians, especially, will break from perhaps Chicagoite economists or whomever, a Keynesian certainly. They'll say that an economic system is not necessarily tied to a social system. These are two different categories, if you will, and I think they're correct there. This is why I find them intriguing. You'll find many in Austrian, and this is evidenced by their many different helicopter memes, that will in fact say that perhaps individual freedom in this social sense is a mistake. Perhaps you shouldn't allow communists in your society. They should be removed. Perhaps you shouldn't allow just any sort of libertine action to take place. Maybe communities need to come together and form their own social organizations. This is what differentiates certainly old libertarians. That's in their earliest manifesto that Rothbard pinned down in the 70s, from neoconservatives and these other sort of pseudo free market apologists. The neoconservatives and the other free market apologists will tie capitalism to social liberalism, libertinism, or capitalism. The older libertarians did not. They would take a much more traditionalist approach and say that this capitalist system functions alongside, or a free enterprise system, whatever term you want to use, functions alongside a separate social organization that can take whatever form emerges. It's not relevant necessarily. Sure, you can empirically show that some forms in history have curtailed the free enterprise system more than others, but that's not necessarily true. You can have a dictatorship and have a free enterprise system. You can have a democracy potentially and have a free enterprise system, though some, once again from history, can show that this isn't lasting. This is a tension that will get resolved. You can have an oligarchy. You can go on and on with different social organizations. Hopefully most people get the point here. This is something that neoconservatives have ignored, and I think a lot of dissidents have sort of taken them at their word, where capitalism has to be tied to democracy, and this is just the way it is. This is not necessarily true. This is reading into history and taking it as sort of as a logical system and not an empirical system. So that's the big complaint that I have here. That I also see a lot of. This is an issue that I see a lot of people engaging in wrongly. Anything to add there, Cal, on that second point?
Well, I mean, the issue that, older libertarians or just sort of analyzing American history in particular, the issue is not conglomerations or corporations or the complex organization of business. It's when it takes the mantle or under the guise of being the government, being the state, being the people, or whatever kind of ideological justification to mask its intentions. And so you have, your generic history of something like Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, and they make it seem like, okay, you read it through the progressive lens, right? Rockefeller, he's this big, spooky, scary oil baron. He's the octopus. He's taking over everything. We have to stop him. The government has to get involved. And so, Roosevelt kind of roughs up Standard Oil and so on. But the reality, as far as I can tell from the actual business history, is that there were many. Rockefeller's monopoly was highly unstable, and he was going to be, he was defeated many times. He only ever had a real monopoly for maybe like 2 or 3 years, dominating American oil. But then, he had to face off in competition with foreign oil companies and cartels. And so the problem isn't that people organize or get together, form these kinds of hierarchies, whether a homeowners association or some kind of business interest or a church or any other kind of social organism. The problem is when it takes on this mantle of sacrosanct status. So this is what you see with people that you get Elon Musk or whatever, the government, however Twitter's being run prior to Musk, and you say, oh well, Twitter is not it's not just a private company. It's the platform for discussion. And so we need, government intervention to regulate it, or to protect our certain dissident interests, or to remove our enemies. And you get the introduction of this kind of crude Schmittian stuff. But the reality is, one day a platform like Twitter will be there, and then one day it won't be, right? Twitter was not that big of a deal. It didn't even exist 20 years ago. And there were other things, and those things are defunct. So new platforms, new interests arise, new organizations arise. The best situation is allow them to be competitive, because other systems, other people will organize to create something that they prefer. It's when you have to sort of staple it down and make this the thing that must exist forever, which is, I think a very human flaw. You're used to something, you don't understand the new thing, you don't want to adjust, you want them to just ratify the way it was always, and then you get this kind of perpetual boomer status. Being a boomer is not being born in the actual baby boomer generation. It's the disposition that you have your eternal youth. It can never change. And then when younger generations come along, they're stupid. There's something wrong with them. They don't understand. And so you have to kind of clamp down and make your youthfulness, even if you're 70, 80, 90 years old, that's the benchmark. History has ended with you. So, I mean, I think with a functioning free market, or well, not free market, but necessarily, but free enterprise, right? It doesn't matter the state of government. It's the ability for people to act and organize in this way without freaking out, because you think, in this small window of time, it seems to be that you're disadvantaged. If you allow people to organize in their own ways without, literally arresting or killing them because they're outside the boundaries, which is, basic kind of Carl Schmitt, this is the big figure, the meme figure, kill your enemies or dispossess your enemies and reward your friends. But this whole process then depends on basically a referee, the government, that can actually do this in a legitimate way. It's not just people posting memes online to decide who your enemies are. The state tells you who your enemies are. So you end up just replicating the same kind of Karl Popper open society where you eject people who will not accept the basis of your accepting society, whatever the basis of your acceptance is, whether it's right wing, left wing, whatever. And so this is why you end up just get stuck in the same place. But unfortunately, right, left wing kind of generic center left ideas are more popular. So yeah, democracy is going to always reward the lowest common denominator of people who know how to rig votes, and so you're going to just constantly lose.
Right, and something else that might be worth pointing out here, on top of all those things about attaching this system to the economic system to a sacrosanct political system, is that this section right here is also another novel divergence from Marxism that many of these neoconservative intellectuals at least dabbled with early on. Marxism holds that although capitalism is less repressive than perhaps the feudal system was, it is certainly extremely repressive. There's not as much individual freedom as one should desire under the capitalist system as there could be under the next system, which would be the socialist system. This is a neoconservative divergence where they're saying that capitalism is where you get the pinnacle of individual freedom. So this very much goes against even Marxist historiography, which was very influential amongst many neoconservatives, as you can see by reading them, where you get this idea that the capitalist system emerged from the feudal Dutch Republic in the 16th, 17th century, give or take, where you had this sort of a mercantile class supplant the landowning feudal nobility. Just think for a second here, because that's where this really gets sort of disproved that this just is Marxism. It's a novel development, but it's not exactly Marxism. From 1600 to say 1940, give or take, do we think that part of Europe was had extreme individual freedom, like perhaps the neoconservatives were wanting, or perhaps the modern day neoconservatives are wanting? And the answer is absolutely no. You could not go into these capitalist societies in the 17th or 18th century during their heyday, and act out exactly as you wanted to. There were still blasphemy laws on the books. There were still state-established churches that were present in society. You had all these different, very authoritarian measures by the neoconservative standpoint that were very much present in society, despite the capitalist economic system that had emerged there. So this is sort of, I think, a very ahistorical idea as well. Either you dispense with this mostly correct idea from my standpoint that capitalism emerged at that time and place as a system that was very much non-feudal. You could perhaps make an argument that there was a concurrent development in Scotland, England, and other similar northern and northwestern European countries. or you dispense with this idea that Crystal puts forward that says that capitalism is tied to individual freedom, because these two things can't coexist. It's very much a presentism. Irving Kristol sees that in modern democratic capitalist society in America post World War II, that there's a law of individual freedom, so therefore capitalism must be tied to it. That idea cannot coexist with history, I would say. So um, just just keep that in mind. And in the interest of time, we'll move on to this last promise. Crystal says, and lastly, it held out the promise that amidst the prosperity and liberty, the individual could satisfy his instinct for self-perfection, for leading a virtuous life that satisfied the demands of his spirit or soul. So, is this tied to a capitalist system? Well, once again, if we go back to the category that free enterprise capitalism, whatever you want to call it, is an economic system, it has absolutely nothing to do with whether a person is allowed to live out a virtuous life. That you would say that's the social system or the religious system, different categories. But if we are to take this just a second and argue on utilitarian grounds here, if you wanted to take an analysis of which systems allow a person to be the most productive, to distribute his surplus to the greatest degree or whatever else, it's probably going to be the system that emerged in England and the United States, the early Republic and the Gilded Age, perhaps continental Europe during the post-Napoleonic age. It's probably going to be that system that allows someone to be the most productive. And you can probably go even earlier. You can look at these. If you were to factor out technology for a moment and just look at what system even allows you to have these surpluses and distribute it as you see fit, purchase, exchange, donate, give to charity, or whatever else, it's probably going to be a free enterprise system, sure, but that's not inherent to it. That whole spiel that I just gave was a utilitarian argument. It has nothing to do with it being tied to one another. This is a logical point that must be understood, and it's where neoconservative economics goes terribly wrong. Is whenever you start tying these social and moral and religious systems to an economic system that aren't necessarily so. So, Cal, anything there on that last point?
No, that's good.
Fantastic. So, now that Crystal sort of organized or laid out what does he think that capitalism is, he's going to go on this giant spiel, appealing to Adam Smith, to Tocqueville, where he's going to make a point that the United States and various other Western democracies, primarily the United States, though, started as aristocratic societies, sort of agrarian and commercial, and they have sort of degenerated up until the modern day, where this aristocratic impulse to live out this virtuous life while having free enterprise and personal liberty has just degraded. It's gone. You don't really have an aristocracy anymore. And Cal, unless you wanted to touch on anything here, I think I can just summarize where he's going with this.
Only that it's interesting that the aristocratic element in the United States was, ultimately was more commercially oriented than the more agrarian populist element. So, I mean, this is why you get, I mean, you can use the term, I guess, generically, the way the media uses it today, populism, and use it to apply to right-wing figures like Trump. And then it's, this dirty word today, applied to European politicians. But populism was always agrarian, and it was always left-wing, and it was always wanting the state to step in and regulate. So this system that Crystal wants to describe, being both democratic and capitalist, is internally, riven with contradictions. It didn't degenerate. It just, it never existed the way that he describes it.
Right. He sort of paints a very interesting dichotomy where he takes this aristocratic planter class and tries to paint them as somehow not being commercially oriented, as if they're just growing for like the aristocratic pursuit or something. It's
right. I mean, this is why. I mean, he's ideological, and this is why he'll title his essay after a Fitzhugh quote. And I find Fitzhugh to be fascinating, but kind of an imbecile, because he's just completely oblivious to how Southern society actually functions, and he creates this very romantic picture of what the agrarian planter is, as opposed to the fact that Southern plantation owners, the large ones, the profitable ones, the ones that dominated both the Whig and Democratic parties in the South, were highly commercially motivated. They had ties to New York and Philadelphia, the ties to London especially, and they were scientists about maximizing profits from their cotton crop. So to act as if there was this, there's this contradiction between the commercial and aristocratic element, and then you get this democratic free society is very silly.
Right, and this is something that I think that even people that are in the present dissident sphere might go a bit too overboard on, is sort of divorcing any sort of commercial activity at all from anything aristocratic, because one has to wonder, even in the feudal ages, how did this great warrior caste, how was it funded? How did they get the materials? How did they get the armor, the horses, and whatever else? Sure, the Lord had them, but how did the Lord get them? It eventually ties back to something commercial.
Right. I
There's
mean,
some sort of exchange going on.
it's a mode of life. So one of the interesting figures, I'm kind of mixed about him from the early American era. Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the Second Bank of the United States. I mean, not only was he a banker, but he funded poetry magazines. Edgar Allan Poe wrote him, asking him to basically subsidize him for writing stories. He led this architecture revival of Greek styles, using kind of flowery Corinthian columns, and building basically basilica. And he saw these things as totally intertwined, that being a man of finance was being a man of culture. And he wrote this bizarre poem anonymously, where he compared himself to Apparently, there was this well-known black porter in Philadelphia who open doors and take care of all sorts of public duties. And he compared himself to being this black guy who just, what was his role? His role was to serve, and he only existed to serve. And people look down on him, but it's necessary for polite society. So the historical fact. I mean, you can go and look at the actual life of the Dutch Republic and these kind of major merchants. They were not like crude coin counting, money driven merchants. They had a much higher view of life, and that means that the economics of it is totally separate and distinct from the mode of life that you conduct, whether you are a commercial merchant or and you also are a warrior and you're a poet and you do all these other things. These all can be easily combined, and they have been.
Right. They're separate categories that can be combined or they can be separated. Certainly now we're certainly in a very commercial society right now that does not value these higher forms of art
Right.
or expression or anything else. And this is actually a very modern development, as I got to witness this summer, thanks to a very dear friend of mine. Like even a commercial hub such as Chicago, which, if we were taking this neoconservative sort of simplification of society and history, should just be very grim, very gray. It should have no beauty associated with it. It's a hub of commerce where the lowest cretins go to exchange in carnal coins and dollars and all these different material concerns. What concern should they have for beauty, being these terrible commercialists, these base people of weights and measures? Well, if you just walk around any of, especially the older hubs of commerce in Chicago, the places are very beautiful, very extravagant, almost decadent to a degree, with the amount of decor and beauty that they were adorned with. And you have to wonder if these merchants are so terribly base in their in how they run things. Why is this commercial hub anything but utilitarian? Why are there such great works of art, such great museums, all these different beautiful architectural styles being used, these great mosaics and glass art forms and whatever else? Why are they being employed in these hubs of commerce? They should be concerned with money. If this neoconservative view of reality is correct, Chicago should just be some brutalistic wasteland, sort of like how Soviet Moscow is portrayed, but it's not. Something is very, very strange here, and I think that any American city that had that at some point should just be able to disprove this just by looking at the remains that are still there that haven't been displaced by our current system. But for whatever reason, neoconservatism still pushed this view, and it has taken hold among all people by the present dissidents when they start to lambast the merchant class as having taken over, pushing liberal ideology and whatever else upon the world and upon their citizens, sort of running amok, to having this very far eastern view of a caste system placed upon the West. somehow that idea has taken hold when just basic sight in these large cities where their older buildings are still standing uh, just proves that these things should not exist the way that they do in reality if this analysis is correct. So I'm more inclined to say that the neoconservative analysis that merchants and uh, commercialism and aristocracy are diametrically opposed. I'm inclined to say that that's false.
Yeah, I mean, it's not capitalist or Henry Ford that made Detroit ugly.
Right,
That just
exactly.
that opens a different question.
Yeah. So, and he'll cite Tocqueville, basically just talking about aristocratic classes and contrasting that to democracies. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Tocqueville. I find him interesting, but I don't know that I would use him to some great degree. Perhaps you have a different perspective on that, Cal.
Not the one I want to get into.
Okay. All right. So, um, basically, Crystal and I don't even think this is really taking Tocqueville at heart. I think this is sort of like a out of context excerpt. Crystal is going to use this Tocquevillian contrast of aristocracy and democracy, and he's going to use that to then infer it is because high culture inevitably has an aristocratic bias, it would not be high if it did not, that from the beginnings of the capitalist era, it has always felt contempt for the bourgeois mode of existence. That mode of existence purposively depreciated the very issues that were its raison d'etre. It did not. It did so by making them as no society had ever dared or desired to do, matters of personal taste, according to the prescription of Adam Smith and his theory of moral sentiment. So basically, Crystal is saying that these capitalist commercialists, these merchants, and these bourgeois elements in society um, were contemptuous of the aristocratic class, and therefore, in their contempt, they watered down all these great forms of high culture, these art forms, and whatever else, to just matters of personal taste that any person from the mass populace could judge for himself, and then by doing so, that's just been watered down to this sort of materialist system that's been inherited in the modern day, which, going back to what we just belabored, clearly isn't true. I don't think you could say that the great works of art, the great collections, and the great architectures, and whatever else you want to say about America, that is almost entirely, if not purely, the result of a commercial class, and very little from an aristocratic class in the form of a feudal hierarchy operating off of fealty and written oaths and whatever else. We didn't have that. Given this commercial class from art, and its love for art, this clearly isn't true. I don't think you can just say they had contempt for an aristocratic class, therefore they watered down high culture. It very much seems to be the opposite. They seem to have carried on high culture, basically until we got to the last century, where the merchant class was very much curtailed in favor of the New Deal and the Great Society and all these other interventionist plans and programs. So, anything on that, Cal?
No, that's good.
Fantastic. So, he then goes on to quote Adam Smith, which once again you can read this. You can read this all in your own time if you want to get the full thing. But it's as I just described. He's going to charge the capitalistic system and the bourgeois as having some sort of an inbuilt hatred for aristocratic society, which hopefully you and the audience can now see that that's a very sort of ahistorical and fanciful worldview. And you can see that just by interacting with any old merchant that was successful in any way, shape, or form. Typically, they aren't just some sort of a base materialist or hedonist of some sort. So you can very easily disprove that. But he's going to continue on with that assumption throughout the rest of this essay. And from here, he's going to start critiquing this capitalist democratic system, but from his own position. He's going to throw the new left a bone and say, this is how you're really supposed to critique the system. You're supposed to do it the way that I'm going to. So from here, he's going to start quoting Hayek. And I'm going to say that he has very much abused Hayek's writings, which is very typical of neoconservatives. If they come across a libertarian, they will just take something, no matter what the context or the purpose for the statement was, and they will just put it on its own, and then reason out from there the argument they want to make, and then take the conclusion that they've already reached and say that this is obvious. So uh, I'm just going to read out this Hayek quote, and we'll summarize Crystal's arguments. So uh, Hayek, writing in the Constitution of Liberty, says most people will object not to the bare fact of inequality, but to the fact that the differences in reward do not correspond to any recognizable differences in the merit of those who receive them. The answer commonly given to this is that a free society on the whole achieves this kind of justice. This, however, is an indefensible contention if by justice is meant proportionality of reward to moral merit. Any attempt to found the case for freedom on this argument is very damaging to it, since it concedes that material rewards ought to be made to correspond to recognizable merit, and then opposes the conclusion that most people will draw from this by an assertion which is untrue. The proper answer is that in a free society, it is neither desirable nor practicable that material rewards should be made generally to correspond to what men recognize as merit, and that it is an essential characteristic of a free society that an individual's position should not necessarily depend on the views that his fellows hold about the merit he has acquired. A society in which the position of an individual was made to correspond to human ideas of moral merit would therefore be the exact opposite of a free society. It would be a society in which people were rewarded for duty performed instead of for success. But if nobody's knowledge is sufficient to guide all human action, there's also no human being who is competent to reward all efforts according to merit. So what Hayek is arguing here is that, and this is not the reason that Crystal cites him, Hayek is here arguing that any free enterprise system, any economic system where people produce and trade freely, profits are not going to go to the most virtuous. They're not going to go to the person that everyone likes the most necessarily. They're going to go to the person that best provides for other people what they want. And that's where material success is going to be established. And here Hayek is basically critiquing sort of a strange burst of thought in the right wing at the time, where people were saying that the free enterprise system naturally rewards the most virtuous because the most virtuous will be the most productive and therefore the most successful in commerce. Hayek is saying that's not necessarily so. The free enterprise system rewards the people that best provide for others, and that's logically what this system entails. Most defenders of a free enterprise system will hold that. So Crystal is then going to abuse this quote to death, and he's basically just going to say, see, since even the best defenders of a free society, of free enterprise and capitalism, say that merit isn't rewarded, something is direly wrong. Which isn't what Hayek is saying. He's saying that they're not materially rewarded by the system. Just because I don't have the most money doesn't mean that there is no actual benefit for being virtuous. There's no incentive or whatever else. Hayek, especially being on the more traditionalist side of the Austrian school, would most certainly not make that claim. So, anything on that Hayek quote, Cal?
No, let's keep going.
Yeah. So, just to summarize what Crystal is saying here, it is interesting to note what Hayek is doing. He is opposing a free society to a just society, because he says, while we know what freedom is, we have no generally accepted knowledge of what justice is. And that's not really what he just said. If you just heard what I read out there from Hayek that Crystal is citing. Hayek is not saying that we have no clue what justice is. He's saying that there's no arbiter who can actually assign people according to their merits material prosperity. It's either intentionally or unintentionally misinterpreting what Hayek is saying here, and this is going to be the foundation for neoconservative critiques of libertarian economics for up until the present day, some of which has been adopted by nominal traditionalists and dissidents. This sounds very much like what you would hear from the average dissident when talking about libertarianism now, as they'll say, oh, well, most of these libertarians say that the free enterprise system or capitalism, whatever word you want to use, doesn't award virtue. They don't reward cohesive societies or whatever else. So it's societal acid. It's a debasement of society, which isn't what they're arguing. They're just saying this is why you have material inequality, and this is why it doesn't correspond to merit. It's just because whoever can provide for other people the best is going to have the best material prosperity in a free enterprise system. That's how the system works. Whether or not you like it or whatever value you want to assign to it is up to you, but that is a fact of the matter. That's how a free enterprise system does work. So whenever Crystal says that Hayek is opposing a free society to a just society, Crystal's painting Hayek as sort of like he values freedom and liberty over order and justice and all these other things. He barely believes in justice. He's a dirty libertarian, which isn't what Hayek is doing. It's very much an abusing of what Hayek writes. And he goes on to quote him again, quoting Hayek. He says, since differentials in wealth and income are not the effect of anyone's design or intentions, it is meaningless to describe the manner in which the market distributed the good things of this world among particular people as just or unjust. No test or criteria have been found or can be found by which such rules of social justice can be assessed. They would have to be determined by the arbitrary will of the holders of power. And before we comment on that, Crystal goes on and he says, now, it may be that this is the best possible defense that can be made of a free society. But if this is the case, one can fairly say that capitalism is, or was one thing, and a free society another. For capitalism, during the first 100 years or so of its existence, did lay claim to being a just social order, and the meaning later given to that concept by Paul Elmer More, such a distribution of power and privilege and of property as the symbol and instrument of these, as at once it will satisfy the distinction of reason among the superior, and will not outrage the feelings of the inferior. So, Crystal is basically just citing Hayek, where he's saying that even if you wanted this moral society that awards material prosperity based off of piety or merit, social merit or virtue or whatever else, it's only going to be according to the person who actually executes the thing. It's only going to be according to the power that actually distributes it, which now Hayek is suddenly sounding like the modern dissident, and Crystal is starting to sound like some head-in-the-closet idealist. But he goes on to give a very sort of a dissident critique of him, where he's saying like, oh, well, maybe freedom isn't actually the thing that we want, since this libertarian is claiming that freedom is opposed to justice. Therefore, we should take justice and not freedom. And he's also saying that this is also an ahistorical idea, since early capitalists saw themselves as being very moral. So this is an intellectual butchering, which, once again, very common for neoconservatives, and something that persists to this day. They will find not just libertarians, but anyone that is to their right, and just butcher anything that they say. Did early defenders of the capitalist system or free enterprise or whatever else consider themselves moral? Yes. Did Hayek consider himself moral as well in defending the free enterprise system? Well, yes. So now we have a contradiction here, according to Crystal, because apparently what Hayek means is that morality is divorced from economic systems. They're separate categories that you can take together or leave separate. Perhaps then it's just that Crystal misread Hayek, or was butchering him, or was purposely abusing his words. So this is just what's happening here. This is a classic neoconservative tactic, and I don't think that Hayek would even argue that a free society is necessarily unjust. It's just unjust by the standards of left-wing social reformers and progressives, because, ironically, for this neoconservative who's now agreeing with them, they simplify everything down to material prosperity. If material prosperity is not equalized, then things are unjust, which is now, strangely, what this supposedly spiritualistic and traditional neoconservative is agreeing with. He's making very much a materialist argument that because the pious, the virtuous, and whomever else are not being awarded with material prosperity, therefore this system is unjust. As if the reason you should be pious or virtuous or whatever else is because material prosperity will be awarded to you. It's a very self-defeating philosophy. If you start financially encouraging virtue and piety and whatever else, you end up with the Pharisees from the Gospels, basically. This weird class that invents their own piety and virtues, their own laws to make themselves more pious, to give themselves more social status, give themselves more material gain. This is what this system ends up in. But for some reason, I don't think that Crystal really addresses this issue that now he has suddenly become the materialist when critiquing the libertarians. So that was a lot of me taking up the air there. Cal, do you have anything to say there?
Only that right, you have, right, a lot of this is, I guess there are a lot of the ideas is that, you treat capitalism in the same way that Marx treats it, as this uh, Leviathan, and it is going to just consume and destroy everything. It will erase all social distinction. So interpreting not only the French Revolution, but the English Civil Wars and all these things, that this is just a leveling instinct, and it will just continue to do this. And then, so as we'll see later, right, there are things that would kind of restrain, almost like catacomb type forces that restrain the full impact of capitalism. So the Protestant work ethic, or the sort of Darwinian justification about the world. But all of these things are too thin to hold back these forces that will just nuke everything. So that's why, if you want to have the good of a capitalistic society, you have to restrain it with responsible statesmanship and blah blah blah. But this if quote unquote capitalism, whatever that is, if it is just a fact of human organization and not some stage or process, that means you can get figures across the board of morality. You can get figures across the board of taste. So it's not because what created the Renaissance. It's not because of some philosopher king, or not really, but it was the Medici, right? And who was Lorenzo Medici? Who's Cosimo the Great? They were merchants, they were bankers. So you can have people who bankroll beautiful art, or you can have Nelson Rockefeller funding Diego Rivera's ugly mural in New York City. So you could get a whole variety of different kinds of styles, because these are distinct questions. And to treat capitalism, especially when you put the ism on the end of it, is a kind of deity that is this almost nihilistic, pernicious force. And that it has to be restrained or channeled. It's not to be defeated, as in socialism, normally, but it has to be kind of channeled and restrained in the interest of justice. You can talk about it in the sense that he's previously talking about is issuing promises. It has requirements. It is a godlike figure, and even God needs help, I guess. So that when you approach it that way, you are trapped in this Marxian view of economics, but even more kind of perverted in the sense that it's moralizing it, not just talking about sheer iron laws of necessity and nature. So I mean, and this is how people talk about it, whether they're academics, vulgar people on the media. There are these systems. They're like gods. You serve them, you restrain them, you have other gods kind of integrate with them. But this is a very childish way of looking at the way things work.
Right, and this is also why neoconservatives tended to be the most moderate to left-wing part of the GOP, especially now that you can see in the modern day. Mitt Romney and George Romney are almost perfect archetypes of the neoconservative, this sort of a liberal who is too right-wing for the ever leftward Democratic Party, who had this basically the same exact view of the economic system as most of the leftists did, just perhaps with a little bit more classical or rhetorical flair attached to it. And this is why you see these moderate neocon type figures. Every time they get into power, you just end up with a basically New Deal light economics every single time, which also is why much more radically libertarian economics, at least within the GOP, is typically a good indicator. If someone starts talking about the responsible role of government to regulate economics or whatever else, especially right now in the present, you can typically be assured that that person is extremely influenced by neoconservatives. If they start talking about government as some sort of plague that is here to destroy your free enterprise system, and how that's going to disrupt and degrade society, you can typically be assured that they probably weren't that influenced by the crystals, for instance. They might not be good, but it's at least a good it's a good red flag that gets raised if they start going on about basically what Crystal is rambling about here in his essay, or if they start talking about the opposite, it's a good green flag. This is perhaps where Rothbard and those cringe anarcho-capitalists and whomever else the dissidents don't like today may actually be a good antidote to a lot of this. Is that Neoconservatives will never take a radical economic position. They will always take this sort of moderate, sort of semi New Deal position that's masked by talk of virtue and merit and whatever else. That's always what they have to take because that's what their system relies on. This isn't just it's not like the neoconservatives just picked up economics and this is where they landed. This is where their system inevitably emerges as this sort of a half-hearted critique of free enterprise and people being productive in favor of piety and virtue and whatever else. It's what a lot of supposedly good conservatives and traditionalists now have adopted as their economic ideologies. What Crystal is articulating here. Um, and in fact, he goes on. He quotes the perhaps the greatest midwit to be quoted by any respectable thinkers, George Fitzhugh, where he says, writing shortly before the Civil War, George Fitzhugh, the most gifted of the Southern apologists for slavery, attacked the capitalist North in these terms. In a free society, none but the selfish virtues are in repute, because none other help a man in the race of competition. In such a society, virtue loses all her loveliness because of her selfish aims. Good men and bad men have the same end in view: self-promotion and self-elevation. So that's what Fitzhugh's critiquing the supposedly capitalist North with, and you have to remember Fitzhugh considered Southern slavery to be like a ideal form of socialism, and therefore the North is a capitalist atomization run amok. Basically, is how it gets characterized now. And Crystal's just latching onto this and taking it at face value. Cal, what was the North very capitalistic in the way that Fitzhugh and Crystal are now describing it at this time, or even at the time that Crystal's writing?
Well, I mean, he's trying to project that when he, his famous kind of summation of this cannibals all is that all the wingnut like free love people and the Fourierists in the North, they're the only ones that get that. This is a very standard apocalyptic account for Fitzhugh. Like the world is about to end. We're going to get the free love communists in the North. It's just a ticking clock. It's about to happen. And of course, right? I mean, obviously, it's not really true. Most Northerners were agrarian. They were spreading out. The cities were not super cramped. Immigration had not become the later difficult catastrophe. With all these people coming from Central, Southern, Eastern Europe. But I think it's funny though is that after the Civil War, Fitzhugh became a Republican. He worked for the Freedmen's Bureau, and then he wrote a retraction saying that wage labor can take the place of slavery as forming a hierarchical society. So he repudiated a lot of this stuff later. But yeah, I mean, it's just this. It's the same kind of argument that that people make. You kill the wasps and you insult them and you bury them and then you kind of reanimate their corpses to make them into caricatures of who they were. And then you justify the complete melting down of a fairly a mercantile commercial society, but one that was oriented far beyond just gain. So when you look at early American financial or industrial problems, it's not the merchants of Boston who are ever suffering kind of absurd whiplash and shock from terrible business decisions because they're all just con artists and scammers. They were the ones that were often suffered the most because of the poor decisions of others, and they often gained because they could survive because they had much more long-term vision. So I mean, the problem with a lot of people, I think, is the time differential. You want things fixed now, or things seem bad now. We need to do something now, but you're not building the institutions that can survive the kinds of shocks that exist in just human life and in life. Subspecie aeternitas. Ultimately, I think it's just this kind of overblown apocalyptic rhetoric that just never manifests until you force it to come true, and then you can it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So for Fitzhugh, the North is going to destroy itself. We have to it's either us or them. Or it's us, the slaveholders, versus the free love people. So you almost form this kind of parasocial bond with your enemies. You need them to exist because otherwise your justification doesn't make any sense. You're not making a positive argument as much as You're just trying to show how, X, Y, or Z, this view of things is unsustainable. And ultimately, there are plenty of merchant families, capitalistic organizations, or governments that apply these principles that do not suffer this catastrophic meltdown. And then again, you depend on a very Marxian view that capitalism has these contradictions; it can't survive. It's this devouring monster, and we have to do something to get the best of it without suffering the consequences.
Right, and this is something that I think is extremely ironic here, is that Crystal took this none but the selfish virtues are in repute because none other help a man in the race of competition. In such a society, virtue loses all her loveliness. That's the title of the essay, is the virtue part from Fitzhugh. But is this true? Do only the selfish virtues actually help someone in the race of competition? And very clearly, the answer to that is no, just on a basic theoretical level. If you have a small society of people, say 100 people in a village, the most selfish among them is not going to gather many friends. And that's going to make life very difficult for him, and it's not going to make it very much easier as the population grows. You're going to find it hard to exchange with people because no one really likes you. You're known as the selfish one. You're probably going to swindle them or something. It's very much selfishness carries with it its own penalties that makes it hard to socially organize. So Fitzhugh here, I think, is just speaking nonsense, and Crystal has just gone along with it because it sounds very poetic and because it serves its purpose here. Is that this idea that any sort of system that that does not overtly value virtue in the way that Crystal is describing it, or the way that Fitzhugh is describing it, must necessarily be selfish. That's not how a society actually works. You can see, quote unquote, societies that are selfish. Most of them are not in Western Europe, where these free enterprise systems emerged. In fact, it's usually Western Europe and the West more generally as a civilization that tends to be the least selfish. And you can see that by its altruism that has very much been weaponized by its current government. So that altruism wasn't there, our current situation would not be here. And why is that altruism there? It's because it's I don't know, maybe the systems that these peoples used for hundreds of years, maybe that has something to do with it. So the basic the crux of the argument here, I think, is very clearly perhaps the easiest refuted thing in this whole essay. This idea that selfishness is something that's the only thing that's promoted in a capitalist system. And Crystal does go on to clarify that he doesn't think that the North was a free society yet at that point in time. It was a bourgeois society. This very novel idea that Crystal has developed earlier in the essay. He has this very romantic view of the North still as this society that was extremely aristocratic, and commercial at the same time. The sort of tension that he thinks cannot last. Which once again is, he doesn't really actually qualify that statement. This central idea that commercialism necessarily degrades aristocratic society. He just asserts it, which is I don't know, a hallmark of neoconservative writings to just assert bad things. So anything on this section, because I think we've pretty well covered it.
Yeah, no, we could keep going.
Okay, so he continues to discuss basically how do people defend this democratic capitalist system, and he has a big diatribe against Hayek here. Definitely a person that he is intellectually opposed. He very much dislikes this sort of growing libertarian movement. The neoconservatives do. They are competing for roughly the same demographic, which is upwardly mobile, the backbone types of people in American society. Perhaps the people that might be have a nice reputation in suburbs and the urban areas and whatever else. If you watch the John Birch Society stream, they're basically competing for the same groups of people that the John Birch Society is competing for, and that's not a coincidence. These neoconservatives that found great safe havens in the National Review with the Buckleyites and those groups of people were very much trying to gatekeep the right from these radical economic positions. They were very much against radicalism and sort of masquerading with classical pursuits of virtue was one way of gatekeeping. So, um, Crystal here puts forward three different defenses of the capitalistic system: the Protestant work ethic, the Darwinian ethic, and the technocratic ethic. And this is interesting because Irving Kristol comes from a secular Jewish background. So when he gets here to the Protestant work ethic, the way he's describing it is very dismal and sort of cavalier. He does not care about it that much. He says that people will defend things with the Protestant work ethic. This, however, is now reserved for the lower socioeconomic levels. It is still believed, and it is still reasonable to believe, that worldly success among the working class, lower middle class, and even the middle class has a definite connection with personal virtues such as diligence, rectitude, sobriety, honesty, ambition, etc., etc. And so far as I can see, the connection is not only credible but demonstrable. It does seem that the traditional bourgeois virtues are efficacious among these classes. At least it is rare to find successful men emerging from these classes who do not, to a significant degree, exemplify them. But no one seriously claims that these traditional virtues will open the corridors of corporate power to anyone, or that the men who now occupy the executive suites are, or even aspire to be, models of bourgeois virtue. So, he's basically just saying the Protestant ethic is a thing of the past. No one actually believes it. It's not how you actually advance the higher tiers of society by the, this is written, I believe, in the 70s, early 70s. And he's basically just saying it's a fanciful rhetoric, basically, to still believe in it by that point in time, which is, I don't know, very convenient for him if that's the case. And for a lot of his compatriots, if that's so, if the Protestant ethic is dead and the Protestants aren't actually a viable bloc anymore, I think that's by the time this is written, I think that's still a bit of an early call, but certainly by the 90s, they're gone from power. They're vestigial. It might be worth asking what group of people is responsible for that death of the of WASP political power. It might be worth investigating that. Maybe it's the Neoconservatives. I don't know. Maybe it was this disparate alliance of Jews, Catholics, and various other secular types that did it. That's up for a different discussion. He goes on and he talks about the Darwinian ethic, where he says, this is to be found mainly among small businessmen who are fond of thinking that their making it is to be explained as the survival of the fittest. They are frequently quite right, of course, in believing that the metaphor appropriate to their condition and to the ways in which they achieved it. But it is preposterous to think that the mass of men will ever accept as legitimate a social order formed in accordance with the laws of the jungle. Men may be animals, but they are political animals. And what comes to not such a different thing, moral animals too. The fact that for several decades after the Civil War, the Darwinian ethic, as popularized by Herbert Spencer, could be taken seriously by so many social theorists, represents one of the most bizarre and sordid episodes in American intellectual history. It did not last, it could not last, and did not. So here he's basically just dismissing the Darwinian ethic, not because it's necessarily wrong, but because people wouldn't believe it, and therefore it's not a good defense. So here suddenly Kristol oscillates from this first one where he's saying, okay, but it's not how it actually works. No one's really a Protestant adherent anymore. Certainly not in the virtuous ways of Calvin or Luther or any of their acolytes. Very practically and realistically oriented. And then we get down here to the Darwinian ethic, and suddenly he is very perturbed by the idea that it could be true, and he dismisses it on democratic grounds, basically, most ironically, where he just says, well, no one believes this, so it's not a good defense. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. I found this to be perhaps the laziest dismissal that he gives in this whole essay. And that's despite the fact that I agree with Rothbard characterizing Herbert Spencer as sort of like a person who very much harmed any sort of good cause for liberty or free enterprise, someone that tried to tie it to Darwinian social theory. However, Rothbard takes a much different approach to Kristol here, where he just dismisses it because of its potential popularity. Rothbard instead sees it as a corrupting of something that was well known at the time with just Darwinian sociology. So the third thing that Kristol throws out as a defense that's given for any sort of free enterprise system, and this is the one that he sticks with throughout the essay, is strangely the technocratic ethic. Kristol says this is the most prevalent justification of corporate capitalism today, and finds expression in an instance on performance, in an insistence on performance. Those who occupy the seats of corporate power and enjoy the prerogatives and privileges thereof are said to acquire legitimacy by their superior ability to achieve superior performance in economic growth, managerial efficiency, technological innovation. In a sense, what is claimed is that these men are accomplishing social tasks and fulfilling social responsibilities in an especially efficacious way. So, this is what Crystal finds to be the most convincing defense of a free enterprise system. Is ironically the most modern and perhaps the most corrupted version is the technocratic element, where people just point at lines on graphs, say they go up better, and that therefore they're the legitimate people on top of the system. Crystal finds this to be the most convincing, which kind of illustrates his priors as a New Deal adherent there, the sort of birth of technocracy in America. But he does have some critiques where he basically just says, well, people will fail eventually. There are ups and downs. So while this system is better than the other two, the Protestant ethic and the Darwinian ethic, technocracy is not itself perfect and has its issues. You're going to have a downturn eventually, and your legitimacy will be gone. And the purpose of legitimacy is to carry through with the downturn so that you maintain stability and power and whatever else. So um, I think that this is really perhaps the most telling part of the essay, where he dismisses Protestants. He finds Darwinian apologia to be too unpopular, and then he goes with the technocracy as the best defense of the free enterprise system and just runs from there. It's very much a mask off moment, if you will. But Cal, perhaps you have a perspective on this different to mine.
Well, this is what I'm saying. So these are these, it kind of fits this mode of thinking where, these ideas, despite being an ideologue, these ideas are kind of masks. So will people believe technocracy? And the answer is, in his day and in our day today is yes, people believe this. I mean, just the other day in person, in real life, in a public setting, I actually got fact checked by some random guy, and it was just appeal to scientists and consensus in a Snopes article. I mean, and so it was absurd in some ways that this happened in face to face, and then he ended up fleeing from me after I started telling him about how the peer review process can be corrupted. But this is a very useful way of getting your cause across, and this is the idea of a just society, kind of revolutionary society of aristocratic virtue through a democratic process, whatever, right? I mean, you see people today saying, well, my views about whatever human biodiversity or whatever, the best way to get it accomplished is through the democratic process or something. So the dissidents end up funneling right back into mainstream. But it is interesting that first of all, right, the Protestant work ethic. I don't think Crystal is unfair about this, but the problem with it is like how Weber describes this. So when he talks about the Protestant work ethic, Weber is basically just saying it's a core concept. It's this it exists. Right, you can look at it again, subspecie aeternitatis. You can, it just exists always. This idea of capitalism, but it doesn't really work in most human history, right? You could talk about capitalism being in ancient China or Rome or something, but the spirit of it, the phenomenon of its justification, doesn't exist. And the only time it really exists, and when he talks about being the Protestant work ethic, is Richard Baxter and Benjamin Franklin is a secular version of Baxter. And so, if you know anything about 17th century Puritan or post-Puritan theology, where Baxter is not a great Calvinist. Baxter, in a lot of ways, is trying to move out of Calvinism to save it. So he's not exactly the image of Protestant thought, let alone, Weber thinks Luther is basically a medieval moron. He doesn't really understand how society works. So you could just dismiss Lutheranism as sort of a compromise and doesn't make any, so it's contradictory. It's sort of half Catholic and can't quite move in the Protestant direction. So Crystal's idea comes from Weber, and the theory itself is a little dubious. And yet Weber talks about this spirit of capitalism. It doesn't really work for bankers, and industrialists don't believe it. The only people who believe it are kind of like petite bourgeois, the shopkeepers and stuff that believe in, hard work is rewarded, and, honest business practice and thrift is rewarded. So nobody believes it. So, okay. So, you dismiss the kind of middle America shopkeepers who were, living in places like Ohio, who were part of the old right. So, they're gone, they're done. And then, the Darwinian thing is interesting, not only because he dismisses it out of hand, but Herbert Spencer himself, following the trajectory of liberalism. It's not that Spencer was like some cold-hearted monster. Spencer was a vegetarian, and he felt really bad about what was happening to the world. And so he also moves with liberalism in Britain, into the late 19th century with, what becomes Gladstone's liberalism, where you do have a more active state to ameliorate poverty. And so, again, it's not that he cares about this. It's just sort of the meme of Herbert Spencer versus, the actual content of his ideas and how it was memed in, through social Darwinism. But it doesn't work. Nobody's going to believe that they're the rabbit that gets eaten by the fox or something, right? Nobody wants to believe that they're a lower food chain being. And so you dismiss it because it's not useful. It has nothing to do with whether it's true or not. So technocracy seems to be true, seems to be believable. The line goes up on the graph. Most people can get that and believe that. And so that seems to be, it's all about this idea of what mask can you wear to advance the basic purpose of, neoconservatism, which is a kind of democratic, materially well-off, just society, not a free society. People are stupid. You have to kind of boss them around, organize them. But with these memes, whether it's technocracy or Darwinian or whatever, but you have to. The keeper of the memes have to be intelligent enough to know which ones stick and which ones don't. And and I think Crystal was right. People believe scientists say 4 out of 5 dentists tell you this toothpaste is good, and then that makes sense. That's reasonable. That's logical. That's rational. And then
Right.
it is creating this. You basically have to create a caste system, or most people are just apes that need memes.
Right, and so I would only just say two things. Is that this is I don't want to rehash like old talking points here, but I have a feeling that this is probably just a much more secular version of what he means by this. And this is something that you mentioned earlier with Weber, is that the interesting thing about the Protestant ethic is that you don't actually have to be Protestant to observe it. It's very much a sociological phenomenon that Weber is pointing out sort of secularly, that it's like a culture that this certain group of people just inherited over time. Uh, when you're pointing out that people will follow the technocratic elite because they have various different authorities that are saying this is true because this many people say so and they have these credentials and whatever else, it is very much analogous to sort of like an old spiritual system where things are true because you hear it from clergy or well-respected laymen or something like that, and because of their repute, it must be true because they probably wouldn't lie to you and they have a reputation for being rigorous and intellectual or whatever else. I have a feeling that this is only true because of a secularization. Up here, I have a feeling that this has the most sort of like backwards application use if you wanted to go back in time, back across the timeline, and see how is this commercial system justified. I have a feeling it's going to be a lot more spiritual than technocratic as time goes on. This feels very much like Crystal is wanting to make everything that's happening right now happen in the present, where he's sort of trying to ignore how things developed, despite using most of this essay up until this point to explain how things developed. And it feels like he's sort of pivoting now to the present. That's how I kind of read this. So, Cal, you're renowned for having very well thought out contrarian takes to these typical talking points. What do you think of that?
Um, I I think when you apply this, it's basically right. A lot of these neoconservatives are secular atheistic Jews. So basically the point of the system is the gods are dead, but you need a priesthood still. So you got to ventriloquize something, some transcendental or some kind of authority that could then justify having a system as if it exists. So, if you start prying at and poking at and being kind of obnoxious to your average person about, what is the people, what is popularity, right? Nobody is ever going to just say, well, it's 51%, it's 50.1%, that you have this slim majoritarian thing, that's the best system. Right? No, nobody, you're talking these flowery terms about the popular will, what do the people want? And this is why I recommend the modern philosopher who I'm working on a thing to kind of analyze for right wing or libertarian or conservative people or whatever it is, Giorgio Agamben. And Agamben basically notes that he's drawing from earlier sociologists, but they notice in these kind of primitive societies that the gods only exist when you sacrifice to them and you name them in ritual. So the whole democratic process basically is summoning ritual for a being that doesn't exist, but then now exists. So this is a very secularizing approach to theology because there is no God, but we can make a God. And we can make a God that does what we want and make a God that makes society more tolerable for the peasantry, and it's more spiritually enriching for the aristocrats who have to bear the horrible, horrible truth that God is not real. God is dead, that we're the ones doing this. And so you have to bear that horrible weight on your shoulders, but it's necessary to have a glorious society. Therefore, right, so you can't rely on stuff. So an interesting thing I was reading, there's a book of essays from a guy named Isfahan Hant called The Jealousy of Trade, and he notices that you get a free trade argument. This is just sort of speckled in around one of his essays, but you get this very strong argument for free enterprise from Jansenists in France, which are a heretical group of super Augustinian Catholics. But they did it. They made this argument for free trade, basically, based on human beings are evil and God governs the world, but God will not destroy His people. And even though the evil are rewarded, this is part of providence. So you don't need men to kind of micromanage or attempt to manipulate trade. Per 17th century Colbertism. Kind of mercantile system of government-run regulated trade. You don't need that because God will ultimately bring about His plan. But that's not a clear cut. Like if you're a good person, you're going to make money. If you're a bad person, you're going to be poor, right? They were too Augustinian to believe something like that. So you by principle by making freedom a certain level of principle. Maybe not the absolute principle, but it is a very important principle. You get justice because God is real. God is true. God is this sort of transcendental force that is, constantly regulating the affairs of men to some extent or another. But if God is dead, if you believe that there is no God, but you need a hierarchy, again, this is very not necessarily Marxian, but even earlier socialists like Charles Fourier or Saint-Simon, you need a church even if there is no God. You need to regulate the spiritual affairs of men, and it is towards the end of creating this just society that again allows the poor to thrive to some extent. They don't grumble, at least, and then the powerful, the elite, they can pursue their higher ends. And a democratic society is the best way because just look at ancient Athens. Look at the demagoguery of Themistocles or Pericles. And look how great they were. They were aristocrats. They were naturally gifted. They didn't need a system to prop them up. They could win the people's hearts. And I think that's the kind of motivating factor for the crystals.
Yeah, fantastic. So I don't actually have much to add to that, and just looking a little bit at the essay here, he kind of accepts this a little bit. He has critiques of it, but he finds this to be by far the most convincing, this technocratic ethic, since we've just barreled past the Darwinian and Protestant ethic. And he basically just says he has that thing about the ups and downs that I mentioned earlier, and then he also he basically just says that if you then tried to define performance by something other than just like the lines on the graphs at the time, you do away with any sort of higher ideal, basically. He says that's where you start debasing things and start technocrat uh, technocratizing. I don't know if that I don't know what the word would be for that. You start measuring everything by performance, and you basically lose any sort of higher ideal, which is true. I don't think that's a wrong statement necessarily. That's not to say that people don't judge performances on their own and make their own judgments, but to have some sort of technocratic justification for everything being by some weird measure of performance certainly would be a debasement. But then perhaps maybe you just need a different justification for the system that isn't a technocracy. But this is sort of like the caveats that he takes with that justification for technocracy. He finds the free enterprise system, insofar as he accepts the technocratic ethic in the way he does, to be beneficial because it delivers the best results. That's why he likes it. And this is also why at the end of this essay you don't really get a policy prescription or a positive vision. He basically is giving a negative vision against the New Left, and this is something that is once again characteristic of neoconservatism. You don't actually get a set policy position from them. It's just vaguely pro this or anti that, but not really in a specific way. They know that some things don't work, some things do work. It's a little bit mixed, so I guess we should just try to get as close to a virtue supporting system as possible. This is basically where this all gets left off at. But this is after he takes a foray into participation and leadership, talking about the New Left again. And basically he just says, well, we're more democratic than ever. But people don't seem to be as involved. So maybe participation isn't the thing that people want. Maybe it's leadership, and that might be why Robert Kennedy was so popular, whereas Hubert Humphrey and Muskie were just they were kind of left by the wayside as society marched forward. And to some extent, I think that he's right. This is certainly Rothbard's critique of the New Left, where he basically just says this amount of democratization is not desired. It's not what people want, and it's impossible physically, even if you did want it, even if it was good on a theoretical level, that it's not. This is sort of his issue with it. However, this sort of neoconservative thing here is he's going to take this this desire for leadership, and he's going to say, well, then the thing that's happened here then is that this capitalist system has denied leadership and has substituted representation and participation for leadership. He's that thing that we discussed at the beginning, where he conflates the social governmental systems with the economic systems, is going to come into heavy play here, where he's basically just saying that the issue with the societies that we have now, with these arguments for a free enterprise system, is that it denies people leadership, it denies people order and stability in favor of freedom and liberty, and that this is very wrongly ordered. This is not what people need. They need order, stability, leadership, and that's where we can find common ground, sort of, with the New Left, at least in their revealed preference. They want leadership and order. They find it in these demagogical figures like Robert Kennedy, and that's why they flock to them. So this is sort of like the culmination of his critique. Is he's basically just saying, well, how can we see this debasement in reality? Well, it's denying people leadership, and that's why this pursuit of liberty and freedom over everything else. That's why it's wrong. People need leadership. They're social animals. Therefore, this whole system, unfettered, is wrong. It needs some sort of fetter. So that's my summarization of that. Cal, was there anything specific from this?
I mean, I think just the way to conceptualize this is, this Crystal is aware, and I think he's absolutely correct, that man wants glory. That's the only thing that makes this interesting. So nobody wants some colorless gray suit Humphrey, reading off kind of stupid statistics about why this tax will help working families, blah, blah, blah. No, they want Kennedy. They want democratic royalty, right? The rising star of Pericles and Athens, right? He's not, some colorless figure. He dominates discussions. He dominates the assembly in Athens. And all these people love Athens, right? Right, not that Athens is to be denigrated necessarily, but right, this is the idea. It's the same idea in Karl Popper. It's the same idea. Every Athens is amazing. The Athens that Plato and Euripides and Socrates found kind of repulsive and disgusting. That this is a good society, and Pericles is what gives it meaning. So nobody wants to just participate in an assembly. People want to get dominated in an assembly. They want this radiance of democratic aristocracy to kind of shine. And so what the neoconservative wants to do is you have to create a system to create this illusion. You need to fabricate miracles. You need to create the sense of awe and wonder. You need a elaborate democratic liturgy. So it's not just, well, it's your responsibility and your duty as a citizen to vote. No, right? The country's going to fall apart. There's dictators and autocracy and authoritarianism, right, and Hitler's coming, and you got to go out there and vote. And you think this is the most colorless activity, but it is imbued with this, power, this responsibility. And it's important to remember, you have to think about this in terms of, soberly and with some analytical cut. You have to think about what is effective action, because there's too many people who are completely delusional. You post one more meme and you're changing the discourse. You're changing the Overton window. Is that really happening? Who knows, right? And I always like talking about this, but one of my favorite video games is a game called Deus Ex. And in Deus Ex, you talk with this AI bot, and it's one of the most profound dialogues in any video game or any media. You talk with this AI bot named Morpheus, and Morpheus says, right, all God is judgment. That's what people want. Humans only exist by judgment. Humans are social animals. They desire judgment. So first we had the gods, and they issued judgments. Then we had celebrity, and then, right, this is the Robert Kennedys. Then they issued judgment. And then we're going to have algorithms that are going to replace that. And the algorithms they'll be the God you make with your own hands. The algorithm will determine whether you are worthy or not. If you are not performing according to the algorithm, your posts get buried. And there's a human element. This is the like Daniel and the dragon, where the priests are going out and like behind the secret door and removing the food, and it's all part of an elaborate ruse to convince the stupid people that the gods are real. But I think Crystal was basically right. But this comes down to this very kind of hard line question. If God is fake or dead, if there is no providence, there is no transcendental reality that holds things together, if it is just animal existence that takes on this quirky human social function that operates according to glory, then building a giant machine to fabricate this is seems like a necessary force. But if there is a transcendental reality where God, nature, something that has a personal will and force in shaping things to have a particular form, is not just empty time but history. There is a meaning. There is something in it towards which all human life seeks, like plants growing towards the sun, flourishing. Then you can rebut this. But for Crystal, right, God is the gods are products of the priesthood, and the priesthood only exists as much as people believe in it, and the priesthood is what gives people a reason to live. Now, people don't believe in the gods anymore, but they believe in lines going up. Maybe like boring stuff about economic efficiency and showing a graph. That's not the most convincing thing. But if you're like, well, we reduced racism by 15% this year. We increased justice by 500%. Freedom is it's going up. Look at this chart. We got maximum freedom. We're happier people. I mean, people eat this stuff up, right? It's scientific. So you just quantify it because those are the gods that the modern priesthood, if you can call it that, that's the one that's what they manufacture, and they confect for the people, and they want to eat up the wonders. And if you don't want to live in that kind of slave society, if you don't want to be trapped by the illusion of kind of fat kind of overweened incompetent imbeciles who keep doing miracles that are fake and increasingly more and more ridiculous and kitsch, then you have to find a way out. And I think that's what you're trying to do in your digest.
Right, and this is I'm glad you mentioned the idea of the ritual having to have a specific sort of spiritual element to it in order to convey its legitimacy. I think that might be perhaps one of the places to be optimistic about. I don't see. I see less people now, and granted, I'm in Oklahoma, so this is certainly not universal. But I do see less people now treating every single election as the ultimate election. as the last place where things can either go terribly right or terribly wrong. I see far less of that than I did when I was in when I was in grade school. I remember when I was in grade school, it was just wall to wall discussion, coverage, conversation with like normal people and all this other stuff about the election, about the terrible things that could happen if X gets in power or if Y doesn't. Um, I see a lot less of that. I have a feeling that perhaps the current ruling class might have overplayed its hand with sort of the uh, characterizing every last ritual as the ultimate or penultimate ritual. I think people might actually be burning out. And
And I think the most important thing, though, is that that has to be cultivated, because what Crystal saw in his own days, that the new left are saying, yeah, we're tired of these gods. The temple's fake. The priesthood's fake. We want to be free. We want to be free. And of course, right, the Crystal's counsel is that, you don't know what you're asking for. You want to live like animals, and you're going to die like animals. You don't understand how civilization functions. That's why we have to go back to Aristotle. We have to, try to revisit classical periods of time. And I think, not that anyone cared about what Crystal said necessarily, but, you basically see this where the new left has to morph into another. They have to basically join the cast if they want to continue the game.
right,
They just change the nature of the gods, or they start changing the myths about the gods to fit, so there's slightly, different vision from what had gone before. So now you get, talking about diversity and equity from, Clinton Democrats shifting from, labor union Democrats in the 1950s, like Humphrey, or, somebody a little bit more charismatic than Humphrey. Maybe it's, something like Roosevelt or something. And so ultimately, this burnout will continue to happen, but I don't think that is necessarily a sign that things are getting better. I think these are these moments of weakness that are going to be kind of re-strengthened in the future. And if people fall for it and don't use these moments of weakness to try to break out in any significant number, then you're just going to get another generation of people who are going to vote for the next George Bush, the next Barack Obama, the next Kennedy, the next Reagan, and the system will just feed off of itself again. And I'm not
right,
talking about the system as if it is, it's like a living thing that's out there. It's like Santa Claus. It exists because we believe it exists. And even if we're cynical and we say we don't really believe in Santa Claus, but you continue the rituals. You don't believe in Santa Claus. Your children don't believe in Santa Claus, but you still put the cookies out and you still write from Santa on presents. That is what the system is, and that's why it continues to exist.
right. And the reason I mentioned the sort of burnout that's happening is not necessarily that itself is victory, but it does allow victory. It allows so Crystal here is dealing with people to his left, and he's gatekeeping them. That was his purpose, basically. Was that if you wanted to be considered like the respectable, sort of sane elite and intelligentsia, you had to have not been gatekept to your left by Crystal and not gatekept to your right by Buckley. Basically, is a simplified way of looking at this. When people start to burn out, I have a feeling that that's the opportunity for people to the right or to the left, not that I want them to win, but that technically is correct, to actually jump on the system and then from there actually change something. That was my point in bringing that up. And then this is where, towards the end of the essay, Crystal basically he starts to appeal to spirituality, where he starts talking about spiritual chaos and how this debased system of technocracy, capitalism, liberalism, and democracy starts to debase people's spirits. This is where he starts to get to the spiritual sort of flair that any nominally conservative piece has to have in order to be considered conservative. Is you have to start talking about spirituality in some way, shape, or form, which. Once again, just to keep a sort of theme going here, is something you can also see with modern dissidents, present dissidents, is that they will do this exact same thing where they will have a grievance where they will spend, say, 10 pages on, sort of critiquing it, and then they will start to appeal to spirituality towards the end to give it some sort of appeal to some spiritual ethos. Um, I I didn't think much of this paragraph. I don't think it's really changing anything. I don't think it contains any new ideas. Did you, Cal?
No, I mean it's
Yeah.
just fluff.
Okay, cool. So, um, and then finally, to end the essay, Crystal starts talking about the reforming spirit, where basically he says true conservatism, as opposed to socialism, communism, and fascism, and opposed to liberalism outside of that category, actually is just liberal reformism, but with certain constraints put on it that liberal reformers don't actually have. This is where you get this sort of like Bismarckian idea of a conservative reformer. It's certainly one that Buckleyites have taken up in with great energy, where they start to point out that, well, you can't just have a stagnant, traditional, backwards society. You have to reform things sometimes, progressively. And this is where Crystal basically bakes this into the foundations of neoconservatism, this sort of half-hearted, lackluster reformist ideal, where you have to reform institutions from inside the institutions, to prevent any radicalism from taking root. You have to make sure that you don't get rid of the necessary parts, but you trim the unnecessary parts. You know, a bunch of trite platitudes that make up this sort of weird conservative philosophy. And this is also for anyone that's been watching the channel long enough. This is or for the last few weeks, I suppose. This is the same critique that was lodged against people like Jordan Cooper, who tried to define conservatism basically as just Whiggish reformism. I feel like that does a great disservice to at least some of the good conservatives, like, say, Kirk. I don't think he would take this very pale, very diluted view of conservatism as just dissatisfied liberal reformers trying to keep the institutions afloat. I don't think he would have liked that. I don't think many conservatives would have liked that either, that were actually genuine in their belief. And this is basically how he ends off his piece, and he makes an appeal at the end not to forget the classical philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Hooker, and Calvin, and all the people that would come along with them. And basically, he just makes an appeal that we need to go back to them. So
I don't understand that list. It's just such a strange, like, what he jumps from, like, he doesn't mention Augustine, but he'll talk about Richard Hooker. It's odd.
Right, and I understand the like Aquinas to Calvin connection there, Aristotle, Aquinas, Calvin, but I don't know that if I like reading Calvin, I find him to be very engaging. There's a lot of cool things in there that I don't necessarily agree with wholeheartedly, given my Lutheranism, but I don't know that I can say that Calvin specifically is a main influencer of a lot of Anglo civilization. I think you could find a lot more of that in a lot of actually Anglican figures rather than just the pure Calvinists. I think that you can find a lot more explanation for, say, Dutch society and Swiss society from Calvin, not necessarily American society. Though you can find the seedlings. I don't know that you can find pure American society, even in its aristocratic form, as Crystal keeps talking about, from Calvin himself. But Cal, I believe you are actually Calvinist, so maybe you disagree with me there.
Yeah, I would use that label. Yeah, I mean, you know, to just be succinct, I do think Calvinism has a strong hold on certain aspects of American history, but it's all depends on how you tell it, whether you start with New England or Virginia or something else. But
Right, yeah.
you know, if we were living in a good traditionally, you know, New England Puritan society, then Irving Crystal would be in the stockades being whipped.
Fantastic. So, that was the Crystal essay, and once again, you can read the whole thing for yourself if you doubted any of our summarizations or how we read into it. So, Cal, this is entirely off of your clock now. Do you have time to just briefly go through Gilder, or if not, I think that we covered this in depth enough. What's your schedule looking like?
Yeah, I could go through Gilder.
Okay, great. So Gilder is a little bit less dismal. He's not going to do this Irving technique where Irving Crystal technique, where he is very dismal about capitalism and only accepts some parts of it where it's beneficial for his sort of weird classical ideal. Gilder is very optimistic. I met him, I think, probably a year ago. If you don't know who Gilder is, he was the intellectual foundation for basically the Reagan campaign on his economic and social philosophy. He's being promoted now by Doug Wilson, I think it was, for his very questionable and outrageous views on men and women. That seems to be the thing that's stuck, is that he has a strange view that I heard him articulate in person, that women civilize men, which is basically the opposite, I think, of every classical thinker. How they would have phrased that. I don't know if they would have considered it civilizing, but this is he's not some random guy. He's not included in this neoconservative essay collection by accident or because the author has a specific niche interest in Gilder. He is influential. This newspaper article was a presentation that was given by Gilder during a Ludwig von Mises lecture series, which is going to be most ironic because I think he has perhaps the most non-Austrian view of everything imaginable when it comes to economics and society. And basically, Gilder's going to start out his essay by saying that a lot of people are characterizing businessmen as these evil, greedy bastards. Businessmen are bastards is the quote that he starts off with from JFK. And he also quotes Smith saying that businessmen seldom gather together except to conspire against the public interest. He's basically just making the case that people have a negative view of businessmen, and this is entirely undeserved because businessmen actually do good things. And I don't feel the need, Cal, unless you do, to go too terribly in depth and read out parts of this essay, because number one, I don't think this like made a intellectual foundation of anything, but I think the generals are what makes this better. What do you think, Cal?
The most fascinating thing is just where he just starts babbling about ancient tribes of people and confusing. I mean, one of the most fascinating things is that he thinks capitalism is something that is like a gift economy among the Yoruba and the Chinese Hui. And so, I mean, this I just want to read this out because of how odd it is, right? This is 3 and 4, bottom of 3 and in the 4. The next step above potlatching was the use of real money. The invention of money enabled a pattern of giving to be extended as far as the reach of faith and trust, from the Mumi's tribe to the world economy. Among the most important transitional devices was the Chinese Hui. This became the key mode of capital formation for the overseas Chinese and their phenomenal successes as trademen and retailers everywhere they went, from San Francisco to Singapore. A more sophisticated and purposeful development of the potlatching principle. The Hui began when the organizer needed money for investment. He would raise it from a group of kin and friends and commit himself to give a series of 10 feasts for them. At each feast, a similar amount of money would be convivially raised and given by lot or by secret bidding to one or another member. The rotating distribution would continue until every member had won a collection. Similar systems called the Ko or the Tanamoshi created savings for the Japanese, the West African Susu device for the Yoruba. When transplanted, I mean, this is just such a bizarre way of framing it. Capitalism is when big man give you stick, right?
Right, and then you are indebted to big man who gave you stick.
Yeah, so I mean, it's I hate to validate anything that George H.W. Bush ever said, but when he called this voodoo economics, I wonder. I mean, I just having read this last night, and I've never read anything by Gilder. It almost sounds like, yeah, this is voodoo economics. You have a big tribesman who collects magic juju, and then you're in his he distributes it, and then you're in his debt, and then that's supply side economics.
Right, and this is how he gets credited by this neoconservative collection. He's basically hailed as the like the harbinger of supply side economics. So. Yeah, calling it voodoo economics, I think, might actually be referencing Gilder. And to be clear, he's extremely intelligent. He's surprisingly articulate in his advanced age. He predicted quite a few technological advancements well before they actually came to fruition. So he's not stupid. I think that he's just incredibly wrong and kind of goofy, just a little bit. So that thing that Cal just read out there from this presentation that Gilder gave at this lecture series is the basis for Gilder, according to Gilder, of the capitalistic system. Rather, he says that the capitalistic system basically emerged by people giving gifts and then other people being socially indebted to them, basically out of honor or kindness. And then that's what allowed currency to emerge. That's what allowed societal trust to emerge, and that's why capitalism is a good civilizing force, which is fantastic in the amount of creativity that it would take to come up with that idea. Like if I sat around at a paper, I don't think I would come up with that explanation ever. but I also think is deeply wrong. And we'll get to that for a couple of reasons. The first explanation economically that he gives for this being correct is Say's law. But he doesn't actually mention Say's law. He mentions Keynes's like weird bastardization of Say's law. He says that supply creates its own demand is a principle of classical economics called Say's law. Any person that has read any of the Austrian literature would just wince at that, because that's specifically the misinterpretation of Say's law that Keynes starts out with in his book, his general theory book, in order to invalidate classical economics. Rather, what Say's law is better construed as is that demand is constituted by supply. So basically, what that means is that I have to supply something in order to then consume. Is the basic way that this comes around. The simplest way you can put this is that in order to consume, you must first supply or produce. So already, Gilder is using this weird Keynesian sort of misinterpretation of Say's law to justify his weird gift economy as real capitalism anthropology. Very, very strange way of going about this. But then he goes on throughout this piece and he starts declaring that money and currency is actually the social is the social representation of debt. That I have currency means that I own someone's debt to me. And he uses the dollar as an example, which is very easy to confuse because technically the dollar is a liability to one entity. But that's not how currency emerges, especially not to any Austrian, which is very strange that he gave this talk at a Ludwig von Mises lecture series. It seems like he's just kind of flaunting his own ideas and not actually trying to do anything within Mises's line of academic inquiry. To the Austrians and to Mises especially, you have a progression of currency development where originally the most saleable good turns into the commonly used medium of exchange. This is why, say, salt in West Africa would become a currency. It's most saleable, as in most people would accept it in exchange for something. And then it becomes just the common medium of exchange to where people are now just acquiring salt because they expect people will accept it, and they're not using the salt necessarily for its productive purposes. And then beyond that, you then get you have this sort of hard currency. It could be gold, salt, silver, or whatever else. And then you start trading in receipts for things, so that you keep them in warehouses. You trade in receipts. This is like the paper currency backed by hard money. And then beyond that, you get the fiat system, which is just a paper money decoupled from any sort of hard exchange. So you're just exchanging paper money for paper money. That's the Austrian conception that this lecture series was named after. Gilder, however, is saying that, well, actually, currency emerged because people need to keep track of their social debts that they just kindly owed to each other upon being given feasts or being done favors for, which is basically a pie in the sky view. I don't know why that would even develop. If this was true, you could see this develop in real time. Do people keep track of their debts with like paper currency or with any sort of physical marker? Well, maybe if the debt is large enough, but then it becomes a ledger and it's denominated in a currency. You're not actually explaining where the currency came from. This is and at that point as well, we wouldn't call that a gift that carries with it a social debt. You would just make that an exchange that is driven by debt. You would consider that borrowing. So, this whole thing is really just fanciful, and I think this might be a good explanation for where Reagan's economic policies were so catastrophically wrong. Is that at their foundations they're just insane. So, anything else that you want to specifically highlight, Cal? So, hold on, before you do that. This is publicly available. You can find this. It's called The Moral Sources of Capitalism. You can read this to verify everything that I just tried to summarize here. So I would in fact encourage people to do it just in the interest of our time so that you can see how weird this is. But yeah, Cal, was there any specific or generality you wanted to highlight?
The only thing was I was skimming through the fairly mediocre tome from Perlstein, the Reagan Land, which I was frustrating. But anyway, he has this quote, and he has one of the chapters titled this, that you don't shoot Santa Claus, and it was this frustration from some within the right about the new economic model, coming from Laffer and other supply side economics advisors to the Reagan campaign. and there's this frustration. It's like, how can you have tax cuts, but then you also don't slash government spending? And the basic rationale was that tax cuts, at least for a number of Americans, tax cuts on property, tax cuts on you know uh, capital gains, all sorts of tax cuts. It seemed to make people wealthier, so it makes them happy, and it's like free gifts from the government, free gifts from Santa Claus, and nobody shoots Santa Claus, and so the basic phenomenon is essentially which is probably why you start seeing these kind of boom bust cycles that kind of rapidly develop in from the 80s onward. But you basically won't address the problem. So you want to cut government taxes, but you don't deal with the ultimate aspect of government spending on a variety of things. One of which I thought was kind of interesting, which I read in this book on Nixon called "The Last Liberal Republican," was that when Nixon implemented welfare, it was actually a lot less expensive than Reagan or Clinton's welfare reforms, because Nixon's welfare just gave money away for free. Basically, you apply. There was still in the 70s that kind of stigma that you don't apply for welfare unless you really need it, because you're basically just robbing the taxpayer, and that was considered bad. But with that, that cultural moray is basically gone.
Right, and beyond just robbing the taxpayer, it showed that you were incapable of providing for yourself. It was a
right.
character defect.
Yeah, exactly. But then with the welfare reforms with Reagan and Clinton, you're saying, well, we don't want to give money to the limousine, welfare queen in her Cadillac. So we need to kind of check out who is applying. And of course, what do you have to do to find the difference between worthy and unworthy welfare recipients? You got to pay caseworkers. So then welfare became actually a lot more expensive, because you got to hire thousands and thousands of useless welfare caseworker parasites to look at all the other welfare parasites to make sure they're not stealing money and unworthily applying for it. So you end up spending more money. And so the system just kind of reconstitutes itself, but in a different form. And so, this is why early on Rothbard writes that article about Reagan is a phony, and that this is not a great victory. And it doesn't ever actually address the problem. It just appears to address the problem. And you take victories for what they're worth. Even if Reagan wasn't perfect, there were some positive things. This is kind of, especially in terms of culture war backlash against the 70s. But you can see the rot, how this never really deals with the problem, and how this sets the stage for the 90s.
Right, and this is like the MO of neoconservative operations. Is specifically you take piecemeal reforms that look very nice, sound very effective, and all this other stuff. But if you look into it for just 5 seconds and contemplate the long-term consequences, or even medium-term consequences, they suddenly turn into just absolutely dumb ideas. This idea that somehow expanding the welfare state into this permanent bureaucratic system that determines for itself who is worthy and unworthy of receiving all this money is a good conservative move. I think only a neoconservative could argue that it is. Just one last thing here about Gilder that I found interesting. And this is a sort of like novelty that he has that I'm not really I don't know that this is carried over into the rest of neoconservatism, but it certainly illustrates the ideal that some people have, and certainly people influenced by Gilder have. He doesn't consider wealth to be material. He considers wealth to be like knowledge and societal reputation and all this other stuff, which those things are good and all, but I don't think we would consider it wealth necessarily. Wealth is supposed to be productive. I don't know that societal reputation is necessarily productive. Certainly not in the modern day. Knowledge as well is not necessarily productive either. And this is sort of like a key misunderstanding that I think that Gilder has with his sort of idiosyncratic economic system that he articulates here, where he equivocates wealth with these intangible things that aren't necessarily productive, or these things that aren't necessarily consumable either. Another way that you can characterize wealth is, can you consume it? So if I'm a ancient shepherd if I have a lot of livestock, I'm wealthy. If I'm in the modern day, if I have a lot of money, I'm wealthy because I can use that money to get things that I want to use for some reason. Um, I don't think that knowledge or reputation are consumable or productive. This is a very strange characterization that sort of like it keeps within the neoconservative tendency to go to these classical ideals that include virtue, knowledge, societal reputation, community, and all these other things. He's just trying to jam it to his economic system, and I don't think it works at all. In fact, I think it is a very it sort of sticks out is what I come away thinking of this. So that was the last thing I really wanted to touch on with Gilder, because he's sort of tacked on in the essay collection, and I think rightly so, sort of like a later influence that wasn't really foundational, but certainly he was a mouthpiece that got ideas to administrations to be enacted, and that he did do. So, any final thoughts on Gilder, Cal?
No, I accept that. I find it really rich that Doug Wilson is trying to, kind of revive him.
Yeah, there were quite a few friends of mine that were sort of like trying to pass off Doug Wilson as as like some sort of meaningful dissident figure within at least Calvinist Christianity. And to be fair, not many other people have made basically their own community for their own people. That's something that he has done. It's just clearly not sustainable just looking at the ideas that he's infusing into that community. This sort of weird civic nationalism, don't say the word white because it's a dirty word idea of a community, I don't think is sustainable. But
I find it very bizarre that he tries to tone police after 10 years ago writing a Confederate apology.
Right,
you kind of lost what's the point?
Right, and is there an explanation for that? Does someone actually have an explanation for that sort of like moderate swing?
I mean, the only reason I would give is that you look at like Abbeville Institute Confederate Neo Lost Cause apologies, and it's all about how like the South was really good to Black people, and everybody got along in this kind of colorblind, not colorblind, but pseudo colorblind, like I just there's such this weird combination of egalitarianism racially and a certain strain of Confederate apology.
Right. Yeah, and I have noticed that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, so that might be a good explanation. Maybe sometime in the future, I and a few others might have to dig into Wilson and evaluate him, because I don't have any hard opinions one way or the other, because he's not really that relevant to me insofar as he very rarely emerges talking about political issues. Usually he just spends his time trying to intertwine his theology into something current, which I don't follow his theology. So that might be a good thing to have people explain it to me here on stream, is the story of Wilson. But yeah, Gilder is the kind of person that he is promoting, which should raise a couple of red flags, I think. But with that, there's no way that I have enough time, certainly not you, Cal, since you did this very much last minute. I don't think we have the time to go through the 30-page selection of Novak talking about the democratic capitalism. So any final thoughts on the neoconservatives before we go to our super chat, Cal?
Do not vote for Nikki Haley. I would rather Joe Biden be emperor for 1,000 years drinking adrenochrome to survive in a catatonic state than Nikki Haley becoming president.
Yeah, and I think that might be I think that's pretty clearly the better option between the two. So with that, we had a very generous donation today from Dan Zammit for $10. Thank you very much. He says, "Thanks for sharing. I learned something today," and that is very much the goal of this, is making sure that, especially with this episode, since I don't know that many people actually read the neoconservatives before they critique them. I mean, the very word neoconservative came from like verbal disagreements between Michael Harrington and these disaffected liberals. I don't know that Harrington was really, maybe he read a couple of their works, but the guy who coined the term didn't really coin it by reading them necessarily. It was by arguing with them. I don't know that anyone on our side has actually read through very many of them. The Prudentialist, I think, has been harping on the neoconservative problem especially creeping into the distance. So you can go check out his more recent appearances. I know he mentions them, and I know for a fact he has read them. But beyond that, I think it might just be a handful of us that have actually looked at what they wrote down and what they said they believed. So I figured this was necessary to do. So hopefully you did learn something. You can hopefully you can see in their writings the different tactics and priors that they have that so characterize the neoconservative movement, the thing that I think all of us dislike strongly. So yeah, with that, I think that was our only donation today. So, Cal, I believe that I have your blog in the description here, but once again, just tell people in case they didn't catch the beginning, who are you, where can they find you, what do you do, and all that.
I have a podcast. I write on a blog and podcast. I have a random anonymous Twitter handle, which is the same as my name here. But that's what I am.
Yeah, fantastic. And then what might people expect to see if they go to read your blog or your Twitter or anything like that?
Incoherent rambling and madness.
Fantastic. Alrighty. So, uh, don't buy into Cal's underselling of himself. He's if you want someone that goes against the grain of sort of like a dissident hive mind has uh, extremely extremely well defended his sources and his justifications for going against the grain. Go check out Cal. He's a I will typically across my timeline maybe once a week see something that is very much I don't know how to say it. It's almost contrarian, but I don't think that you're like Sandbach, where you will just be contrarian for the sake of it some of the times, which is something he
No,
actually
I'm
admitted
a
on one of
very
my
agreeable
streams.
person. I just want to figure things out.
Yeah. So go check out Cal once again. You can find his blog in the description. Your Twitter account is locked, so I did not actually link that. I can change that in post, but we'll talk about that later if you so want it. But yeah, go check him out. Thank you very much for joining me today, Cal. It was I'm especially glad that you could do it because this is a last minute organization. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Fantastic. So next week, I believe I will be joined at least by Grant Brooks once again to discuss the foreign policy side of the neoconservatives as they had written. We'll be discussing Kirkpatrick and a few others, talking about their support for foreign dictatorships, military intervention, and a sort of global American presence. So if you are interested more in more of the neoconservatives and what they wrote, tune in next Saturday, and we'll see what other guests we'll have joining us, because I think more people were open to next Saturday than this one. So thank you all. Hopefully I'll see you all again in a week's time, and have a good rest of the day.